Chapter 9. Mad-Eye Moody. The storm had blown itself out by the following morning, though the ceiling of the great hall was still gloomy. Heavy clouds of pewter grey swirled overhead as Violet and Tracy huddled together to examine their new course schedules at breakfast. On the other side of the table, Cass was perusing his own schedule and ignoring them both. Transfiguration this morning, Tracy was saying, pointing at Violet's schedule with the end of her fork, and then care of magical creatures right after, will still be with the Gryffindors, noted Violet. That's good, I can keep an eye on Harry. Heaven forbid he's out of your sight for a moment, Tracy muttered teasingly. Oh look, we've got double electives this afternoon. Beings and beasts, that's Lupin's new class, isn't it? Have you spoken to him yet? Violet shook her head. Haven't had a chance to know, she said. He said to come and see him as soon as I could in his last letter, so I'll probably skip lunch to go and meet with him. You never skip meals, said Cass, and Violet looked up to find him frowning at her over his own schedule. Her face grew slightly warm. I do sometimes, she said loftily, if it's something important. Cass scowled and went back to hiding behind his course schedule. There was a sudden rustling noise above them, and 100 owls came soaring through the open windows, carrying the morning mail. Instinctively, Violet looked up for Hedwig, but there was no sign of white among the mass of brown and grey. Now that they were back at Hogwarts, almost everyone who might want to talk to her or Harry was readily available, with the exception of Sirius. But with his trial only a day away, Violet was sure he must be too busy to write. A great eagle owl soared down the length of the Slytherin table and swooped dramatically to land on Draco Malfoy's shoulder, carrying what looked like his usual supply of sweets and cakes from home. Now that she had seen his mother up close, Violet was absolutely certain that it was a servant who baked them. Mrs. Malfoy didn't look like the sort of woman to set foot in a kitchen except to bark orders. But seeing Draco's grinning face reminded Violet of what Harry had told her on the night of the World Cup. Malfoy, watching the chaos unconcernedly, all but admitting that his father was out there in the crowd, blasting tents and tormenting innocent muggles. It made her sick. Worse, it didn't surprise her at all. Malfoy had made no secret of his hatred for muggles, or for anyone he deemed inferior to himself. Violet thought of the little boy spinning in midair, head lolling limply, and felt her stomach turn. She pushed her plate away from her. The sickness lasted all through their first transfiguration lesson. Professor McGonagall was so disappointed in how few people had completed their summer homework. Crabbe and Goyle were left glowering in shame after her particularly harsh chastisement that an additional essay was assigned to make up for it. Even those who had completed the original S were not exempt, which Violet thought was very unfair. The first day of class was spent in silent reading, and already they had homework. Already in a foul mood, Violet was grateful when the booming bell echoed from high above them, signaling the end of the lesson. She and Tracy left the classroom in a huff and headed out the front doors, down the sloping lawn toward Hagrid's small wooden cabin, which stood on the edge of the forbidden forest. Hagrid was standing outside his hut, one hand on the collar of his enormous boarhound, Fang. There were several open wooden crates on the ground at his feet, and Fang was whimpering and straining at his collar, apparently keen to investigate the contents more closely. The Gryffindors, as usual, were already gathered, and Tracy and Violet went to stand near Harry, Ron, and Hermione. As they drew nearer, an odd rattling noise reached their ears, punctuated by what sounded like minor explosions. "Mornin'," Hagrid said, grinning at them all. "Glad you're all on time. Yeah, want ter miss this blast-ended scroots." "Come again," said Ron. Hagrid pointed down into the crates. "Yug," squealed a Gryffindor girl, jumping backward. Yug just about summed up the blast-ended scroots in Violet's opinion, which was a strong mark of just how horrible they really were. Violet, like Hagrid, was quite keen on monsters, and liked to spend time learning about as many strange and fascinating creatures as she could. These, however, were something she had no desire whatsoever to deal with. They looked like deformed, shellless lobsters, horribly pale and slimy-looking, with legs sticking out in very odd places and no visible heads. There were about 100 of them in each crate, each about 6 inches long, crawling over one another, bumping blindly into the sides of the boxes. They were giving off a very powerful smell of rotting fish. Every now and then, sparks would fly out of the end of a scroot, and with a small fot, it would be propelled forward several inches. "Ani Jus hatched," said Hagrid proudly, "so ye'll be able to raise 'em yourselves. Thought we'd make a bit of a project of it. And why would we want to raise them?" said a cold voice. The speaker was Malfoy. Crabbe and Goyle were chuckling appreciatively at his words, as they did with every stupid thing Malfoy had to say. Hagrid looked stumped at the question. "I mean, what do they do?" asked Malfoy. "What is the point of them?" "Well, that's the point of you," Violet asked loudly, unable to stop herself. All the Gryffindors laughed, and Millicent Bulstrode had to quickly hide her grin behind her hand. Malfoy's face, now slightly pink, was livid. Now," said Hagrid, giving Violet a look that surely would have been reproachful if he wasn't trying not to smile. "Thar's next lesson, Malfoy. Your juice feedin' 'em today. Now, Yale wan, try 'em on a few different things I've never had 'em before. Not sure what they'll go fur. I got ant eggs and frog livers and a bit of grass snake. Just try 'em out with a bit of each." Nothing but deep affection for Hagrid could have made Violet and Tracy pick up squelchy handfuls of frog liver and lower them into the crates to tempt the blast-ended scroots. Unfortunately, the scroots didn't seem very interested in anything that was put in front of them. Violet wasn't even sure they had mouths. "Ouch!" yelled Dean Thomas after about 10 minutes. "It got me." Hagrid hurried over to him, looking anxious. "Its end exploded," said Dean angrily, showing Hagrid a burn on his hand. "Ah, yeah, that can happen when they blast off," said Hagrid, nodding. "Yug," said the same Gryffindor girl as before, who Violet recognized but still didn't know her name. "Yug, Hagrid, what's that pointy thing on it?" "Ah, some of 'em have got stings," said Hagrid enthusiastically. The girl quickly withdrew her hand from the box. "I reckon they're the males. The got sorta sucker things on their bellies. I think they might be suck blood." "Oh my God," Tracy said, as they made their way back up to the castle for lunch an hour later, looking slightly panicked. "Those are the grossest things I've ever seen in my life, and they kept getting worse." "Worse than the flobberworms?" Violet asked, grinning slyly at her. "Much worse flobberworms didn't burn or sting or try to suck my blood." "At least they're small." "They areno," said Violet, "but once Hagrid's found out what they eat, I expect they'll be 6 feet long." "Oh, stop it," Tracy cried, smacking Violet's arm. "I'm going to have nightmares about those things crawling all over me. I just know it. The best thing to do would be to stamp on the lot of them before they start attacking us all." They sat down at the Slytherin table and helped themselves to lamb chops and potatoes. Violet began eating very quickly, and was halfway through clearing her plate when Cass sat down beside her. "Gravy's a good look on you," he commented, staring at her, and Violet quickly wiped her face with the back of her hand. "Thanks," she said, with as much dignity as she could muster with her mouth bulging with sprouts. "I hear it's all the rage in Paris." Cassius choked into his pumpkin juice. "I'll be sure to ask the Beauxbaton students about that when they get here," he said, grinning. Violet flushed and continued to shovel down her food. When her plate was clean, she leapt to her feet. "I'll be with Lupin," she told Tracy, and departed at high speed. It took no time at all for her feet to carry her to the 3rd floor, down a very familiar corridor at the end of which stood a statue of a wizened, hump-backed, one-eyed old crone. Violet and Harry had made the subterranean journey together, though her hump several times to sneak out of the castle, and join their friends in Hogsmeade, something that they would never be forced to do again, now that they had permission. But it wasn't the statue of the one-eyed witch that Violet had come to see. She stopped outside the door just across from it, took a moment to collect herself, and knocked. "Come in," called a voice from inside. Violet opened the door and peeped inside, and her face split into a wide grin. "Hello, sir," she said to Professor Lupin, who was rising to his feet behind his desk. Hello, Violet, he said warmly, grinning as well. I hoped it would be you. Oh. Professor Lupin staggered slightly as Violet raced across the room and hugged him round the middle. He stiffened, and for a terrible moment she feared she'd overstepped her bounds, and then Lupin's arms settled firmly around her and held her fast. I'm so glad to see you again, he said softly, and Violet immediately felt tears spring to her eyes. She'd been very good about not crying as of late, not without practice. Tears had always come easily to Violet, but she was getting tired of people mocking her for it, but at this particular moment there was no stopping it. Me too, she said wetly. They held on to each other for a moment longer before Lupin loosened his hold, and Violet was forced to concede that the hug was over. She smiled up at her godfather and quickly wiped the tears from her cheeks. You've cut your hair, Lupin said, nodding at the fringe across her forehead. Aunt Petunia said it was getting too long, she explained, and then wished she hadn't, as concern immediately creased Professor Lupin's brow. And how do you feel about it? He asked. I don't mind it, Violet lied, reaching up to straighten her fringe. Mrs. Weasley braided it for me before we left. That was very kind of her. She's very kind, I suppose, Professor Lupin smiled. The Weasleys are good people, or so I've heard. He took a step back, leaning on his desk, and tucked his hands into his pockets. I'm glad you and Harry were able to spend some time with your friends. They're Harry's friends, mostly, Violet blurted. Well, I mean I get along with Fred and George and Ginny, but it's Ron that Harry gets on with most, and Hermione was there as well. I didn't get to see my friends at all this summer. Violet realized that she was complaining rather bitterly at that and shut her mouth. Lupin was smiling at her, though, his head tilted slightly to the side. He looked healthier than Violet had ever seen him, now that she was close enough for a proper look. His young face was still prematurely lined, though less gaunt, and the dark circles under his eyes were almost completely faded. His brown robe still had patches on the elbows, but they no longer appeared worn and threadbare. How was your summer? Violet asked quickly. Have you been here at Hogwarts the whole time? Not the whole time, but I have been spending quite a bit of time here, Lupin said. Professor Dumbledore has been kind enough to secure a set of quarters for me to reside in year-round. That's wonderful. It is, indeed, he said, smiling, and far more comfortable than where I was staying previously. Albus has been very kind as of late. I'm very thankful to him for the opportunities he's given me. You're a brilliant teacher, Violet told him earnestly, and I know you'll be brilliant again this year. Dumbledore should have hired you ages ago. Lupin ducked his head, looking bashful. Thank you, Violet. I appreciate your confidence in me. It's not just me, Violet continued. There's Harry and Tracy and Cass and loads of people who's ever been in your class knows what a good teacher you are. That's very kind of you, Violet. I suppose I'm allowed to enjoy a bit of flattery now and again. I'm very grateful for all the trouble you and Harry have gone through on my behalf. It's not trouble, said Violet firmly. It's just the right thing to do. Lupin blinked at her. Then, surprisingly, he laughed. Careful now, he said. I think Harry might be rubbing off on you. That was a very Gryffindor thing you've just said. Slytherins can do the right thing too, said Violet, jutting out her chin proudly. We're not all slimy prats like Malfoy, you know. Ah, well, as an unbiased teacher, I wouldn't know anything about that, Lupin said, his hazel eyes twinkling. That twinkle vanished almost at once, though, as concern creased his brow once more. Speaking of Malfoy, actually. I heard that you and Harry were present at the Quidditch World Cup. How much of that did you get to see? We were right in the middle of it, Violet said. The lines in Lupin's face became more pronounced as she told him all the details of what had happened that night: the masked men and the marching crowds, the floating muggles, the dark mark. It's a wonder more people weren't hurt, muttered Lupin, looking very disturbed. Are you all right, Violet? No bumps or bruises. Not a scratch, Violet said, but then, well, I think I got stunned, but that didn't really leave a mark, so, stunned, repeated Lupin sharply. as in hit with a stunning charm. Yeah, they weren't aiming at me through, she said quickly, seeing the stricken expression on his face. The ministry was trying to catch whoever cast the dark mark, and I was running through the trees when the spell hit me. Lupin's shock and outrage was headed off by the sound of a great bell ringing from somewhere overhead, signaling the start of afternoon lessons. Lupin looked down at Violet and frowned. "Well," he said tightly, "I'm very glad that you're all right at least. You'll have to tell me about all this later on. Why don't you find a seat? I've got to finish setting things up for today's lesson." Violet took a seat in the front row, right in the middle of the room, and watched as Professor Lupin flipped through an open book on his desk. The class slowly began to file in. As it was a double lesson, the Slytherins would be sharing the time with Hufflepuff, a couple of them at least. Violet watched as Susanna Runcorn, Millicent Bulstrode, and Theodore Nott from her own house entered the room and found their seats, followed shortly by two Hufflepuff girls that Violet recognized as Hannah Abbott and Susan Bones, and another boy called Ernie Macmillan, huddled close together and looking around nervously at their Slytherin classmates. When everyone was seated, Professor Lupin closed the door with a casual wave of his wand. "No need to get your books out just yet," he said, holding up a hand. "Are we starting with another practical lesson, sir?" asked Hannah Abbott excitedly. "Not quite, Hannah," said Lupin, smiling slightly. "There won't be any demonstrations from me." Although another languid wave of his wand, and a piece of chalk flew into the air and began scribbling on the blackboard in large, blocky letters. It wrote out the word beasts, followed by the word beings, and then drew a diagonal line between them. Professor Lupin turned back to the class and said, "I would like for you to demonstrate your knowledge on the topic. Who here can name a beast?" The class was silent. Violet looked around nervously and found nearly everyone else doing the same thing, hoping someone else would go first. Lupin smiled encouragingly. "Oh, come now, don't make me start calling names. Think back to least year what are some of the creatures we covered in my class." "Kappas," suggested Millicent timidly. Lupin pointed at her. "Very good, Millicent, yes. Kappas are beasts. What else?" "Theodore, red caps," said Theodore Nott. "Red caps, yes." The piece of chalk was in the air again, writing out creature names beneath the word beasts. "What else did we cover?" "Boggarts," said Ernie Macmillan loudly. "Aha, boggarts, that's a tricky one, actually. You see, while boggarts are not beings by any stretch of the imagination, nor are they precisely beasts. They belong, like several other creatures we've covered, in a separate category altogether." Lupin turned toward the blackboard, and with another flick of his wand, the chalk wrote out non-beings off to the side, and the word boggarts just beneath it. "All right, keep it going," Lupin said. "Let's a good long list up here. Susanna, have you got something?" "Oh, grindelows. Very good, yes. How about something we didn't cover last year?" "What other creatures do you think might be beasts, Violet?" Violet, startled by the sound of her own name, blurted out, "Dragons." "Dragons," Lupin laughed. "Yes, very beastly indeed, though some might disagree with you on that." He gave a conspiratorial little wink, and Violet was certain he was talking about Hagrid, who had once hatched a dragon egg in his fireplace and tried to raise it inside of his small wooden hut. And so the first part of the class went on, going round and taking turns naming various magical creatures and monsters. Violet considered herself to have something of an advantage, though it had nothing to do with being the teacher's goddaughter. Studying monsters was a passion of hers. She had a small collection of books covering all sorts of vicious, nightmarish critters, from dwellers of the deepest oceans to inhabitants of dark woodlands. The list on the blackboard contained all manner of beasts. Gnomes and trolls were up there, along with unicorns, kelpies, pixies, basilisks, neasels, and to everyone's surprise, flabberworms. "While not known for being dangerous," Lupin said, in response to their amused disbelief, "there is a very good reason for them being on this list. Now that we've got some examples up here, I wonder if anyone has spotted the pattern yet." Professor Lupin took a step to the side. leaving the blackboard wide open so that they could all read what was written there. Hinkerpunks were listed as well, but they, like Bargarts, had been placed under the heading of non-beings. It had been Violet who had calmly, and a high, questioning lilt to her voice, called out the suggestion afterwards. She'd wanted to beat anyone else to it, hoping to spare Lupin any sort of involuntary reaction he might have had. As it was, she saw the corner of his mouth twitch when he looked at her, almost like he'd known what she'd been thinking. Violet noted with interest that he only included werewolves under the category of beasts, and not also in beings. What? Professor Lupin began thoughtfully, rubbing his chin as he examined the list on the blackboard, defines a beast. They're dangerous, offered Ernie. Are they? Said Lupin. The chalk circled both unicorns and flabberworms. While unicorns are able to defend themselves if threatened, they aren't naturally aggressive. Nor are flabberworms, as those who have taken Hagrid's Care of Magical Creatures class will probably know. Flabberworms aren't much of anything, really, other than slimy. The class chuckled. Lupin looked back to the board. So, what do all of these creatures have in common? He prompted. What makes them inherently beastly? They're all animals, suggested Theodore uncertainly. A bit broad, but you're closer than you might think, Lupin said. He turned back to the class. Let's try something else, and this ought to offer you a bit more perspective. What are some beings that you can think of? Hannah. Humans, said Hannah. A few people chuckled, but Professor Lupin nodded approvingly. Absolutely. All humans are beings without question. What else? House elves, said Violet at once. Or elves. Are there non-house elves? That is a very good question, Violet, Lupin said as the chalk flew across the board, and something that we will certainly be covering in the near future. 5 points to Slytherin. What are some other creatures that you think could be beings? Goblins, said Susanna. Ghosts, said Susan. Ah, ghosts, said Professor Lupin, shaking his head. I'm afraid some of them will be terribly upset with me for this, but the piece of chalk added the word ghosts under the non-beings header. Ghosts are not, from a strictly legal standpoint, classified as beings. A matter which has drawn heavy debate on both sides of the issue, as I'm sure the Fat Friar will be more than happy to tell you about, should you take the time to ask. I cannot offer such assurances about the Bloody Baron, however. The Fat Friar and the Bloody Baron were both ghosts that resided within Hogwarts and belonged to Hufflepuff and Slytherin, respectively. While the Friar was a kind, jovial sort who loved speaking to the members of his house, the Baron was as unapproachable as they came. A very serious-looking man wearing robes splattered in ghostly silver blood. Violet had never seen him speaking to anyone aside from the other ghosts, and Peeves the poltergeist. The Bloody Baron was the only person that Peeves would obey, aside from Albus Dumbledore himself. And if a creature of pure mischief was frightened of the Bloody Baron, then Violet figured she was wise to steer clear of him as well. Lupin allowed them all to puzzle over the subject of beings for a while longer. A surprisingly short list had been comprised, and even more names merfolk and centaurs included, much to most people's confusion, were added to the list of beasts. Finally, when they all ran out of stranger non-humans to shout out the names of, Professor Lupin relented and let the piece of chalk hover attentively in the air. So we have humans, he pointed to the word humans, and elves, he pointed to elves as well, and continued down the list, goblins, vampires, giants, hags, and Vila listed here as beings. That's not a very long list, especially compared with our notes on beasts. What does that tell you, Susan? Susan Bones, who appeared to be painstakingly copying each list onto a piece of parchment, jumped slightly in her seat. Oh, she looked uncertainly down at her notes. It tells me that being a being is really selective. Selective, yes, that's an excellent word for it, said Professor Lupin. 5 points to Hufflepuff. Susan beamed. Lupin grabbed the piece of chalk out of midair and walked up the blackboard. He wrote the word selective on it by hand, and without turning around called, What do you all think makes beings such an exclusive little list? What traits do beings exhibit that beasts do not? They can talk. Trolls can talk, as well as leprechauns and plenty of other creatures, Theodore. But you're on the right track. Beings can talk properly, said Millicent unexpectedly, sounding confident, like they know what they're saying. They know what they're saying. Very good, we're getting warmer, cried Lupin encouragingly. What's a good word for that, to know, anybody? They understand, Violet said, struck with sudden clarity. Lupin turned around and pointed at her. Excellent, Violet, yes, he said excitedly. The most important factor that separates beings and beasts is the level of understanding that they are capable of. Creatures like trolls and jarves may be able to mimic human speech or even be taught a few simple phrases, but because they are unable to comprehend the meaning of whatever it is they've learned to say, they are defined as beasts. The standard that defines something as a being is, and make sure to write this down. Please, Professor Lupin waited patiently, while those who hadn't already done so scrambled to get a quill and parchment out of their bags. When the class was attentive once more, he said slowly, a being is defined as any creature that has sufficient intelligence to understand the laws of the magical community and to bear part of the responsibility in shaping those laws. Everyone dutifully copied these words into their notes and looked back up at Professor Lupin. Violet stuck her hand up the air. Violet question. Yes, why are centaurs classified as beasts? She asked. I've met one before, and they seemed very intelligent and more than capable of understanding of things like language and laws. Oh, yes, centaurs are very intelligent, Lupin said, smiling. Centaurs are a fairly advanced magical race, all things considered. They have their own laws, their own society and communities, and they are highly skilled in things like divination and astronomy. But that's not fair, then, cried Susan Bones. If they're so smart, how come we've got them listed as beasts? Professor Lupin smiled and said, because they asked to be. The students looked around at one another, dumbstruck, and Lupin clapped his hands together. Well, he started, I think that's a good place to stop for today. We covered a lot of ground. I'm very pleased with all of you and your ability to think critically. Another 5 points to Slytherin and Hufflepuff. Go ahead and pack up your things. We'll pick back up next week. Violet joined the class in hastily tucking away her notes, but hung back as everyone else filed out of the room, chattering excitedly. She started to approach Lupin's desk, eager to tell him how much she'd enjoyed his first lesson, but was surprised when he gently waved her away. I've got to clean this up, he said, gesturing to the blackboard, and reorganize some lesson notes now that I know what assumptions I'll be working with. Go on to dinner, Violet. We can speak later. His smile was kind and encouraging, but the dismissal still stung. Violet hurried out of the classroom and joined the crowd descending the staircases back to the great hall and dinner. Cass and Tracy waved her over to join them in line, chatting together and seemingly made up from their previous disagreement. How was it? Tracy asked excitedly as Violet approached. What sort of homework did Lupin give? None, said Violet, forcing a smile. And we got about 10 points for asking good questions. Oh, lucky, said Harry's voice, and Violet turned to find her brother approaching with Ron and Hermione in tow. Trelawney gave us loads of homework. How's Lupin? You haven't been to see him yet, said Violet, surprised. Harry shook his head. I haven't really had time, he said with a grimace. Maybe tonight I'll. Harry didn't finish blurting out his plans to break school rules on the first day back. A loud, cold voice rang out from behind them. Weasley. Hey, Weasley. Harry, Ron, and Hermione turned, and Violet turned with them. Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle were standing there, each looking thoroughly pleased about something. What? Said Ron shortly. Your dad's in the paper, Weasley, said Malfoy, brandishing a copy of Thedily Prophetan, speaking very loudly, so that everyone in the packed entrance hall could hear. Listen to this. Further mistakes at the Ministry of Magic. It seems as though the Ministry of Magic's troubles are not yet at an end, writes Rita Skeeter, special correspondent. Recently under fire for its poor crowd control at the Quidditch World Cup, and still unable to account for the disappearance of one of its witches, The ministry was plunged into fresh embarrassment yesterday by the antics of Arnold Weasley, of the misuse of Muggle artifacts office. Malfoy looked up. Imagine them not even getting his name right. It's almost as though he's a complete nonentity, isn't it? He crowed. Everyone in the entrance hall was listening now. Malfoy straightened the paper with a flourish and read on. Arnold Weasley, who was charged with possession of a flying car 2 years ago, was yesterday involved in a tussle with several Muggle lawkeepers, policemen, over a number of highly aggressive dustbins. Mr. Weasley appeared to have rushed to the aid of Alastor, Mad-Eye Moody, the aged ex-Sora who retired from the ministry when no longer able to tell the difference between a handshake and attempted murder. Unsurprisingly, Mr. Weasley found, upon arrival at Mr. Moody's heavily guarded house, that Mr. Moody had once again raised a false alarm. Mr. Weasley was forced to modify several memories before he could escape from the policemen, but refused to answer Daily Prophet questions about why he had involved the ministry in such an undignified and potentially embarrassing scene. "And there's a picture, Weasley," said Malfoy, flipping the paper over and holding it up. "A picture of your parents outside their house, if you can call it a house. Your mother could do with losing a bit of weight, couldn't she?" Ron was shaking with fury. Everyone was staring at him. "Get stuffed, Malfoy," said Harry. "Come on, Ron." "Oh yeah, you two were staying with them this summer, weren't you, Potter?" sneered Malfoy. "So tell me, is his mother really that porky, or is it just the picture?" "Don't you talk about her like that," Violet snapped, rounding on him. Both Harry and Hermione had grabbed the back of Ron's robes to stop him launching himself at Malfoy. "Shut your mouth, or I'll shut it for you." "What's it matter to you, Potter?" Malfoy said with a nasty sneer. "She's not your fat mum." "Oh, but that's right, you haven't gone one, have you, fat or otherwise?" Violet only got to take one step toward Malfoy when Harry grabbed the back of her robes as well. "You know your mother, Malfoy," said Harry, pulling Violet back toward him with difficulty. "That expression she's got, like she's got dung under her nose. Has she always looked like that, or was it just because you were with her?" Malfoy's pale face went slightly pink. "Don't you dare insult my mother, Potter." "Oh, I see," Violet snapped. "You can dish it out, but you can't take it. You're pathetic," she said, turning away. Bang. Several people screamed. Violet felt something white-hot graze the side of her face. She stumbled and nearly lost her footing as Harry shoved her behind him. Reaching into his robes for his wand, there was a second loud bang and a roar that echoed through the entrance hall. "Oh no, you don't, laddie." Violet spun around. Professor Moody was limping down the marble staircase. His wand was out, and it was pointing right at a pure white ferret, which was shivering on the stone-flagged floor exactly where Malfoy had been standing. There was a terrified silence in the entrance hall. Nobody but Moody was moving a muscle. Moody turned to look at Harry and Violet at least. His normal eye was looking at them. The other one was pointing into the back of his head. "Did he get you, girl?" Moody growled. His voice was low and gravelly. "No," said Violet, holding a hand to her cheek. "He missed." "Leave it," Moody shouted. "Sorry," Violet said, dropping her hand immediately. "Not you him," Moody growled, jerking his thumb over his shoulder at Crabbe, who had just frozen, about to pick up the white ferret. It seemed that Moody's rolling eye was magical and could see out of the back of his head. Moody started to limp toward Crabbe, Goyle, and the ferret, which gave a terrified squeak and took off, streaking toward the dungeons. "I don't think so," roared Moody, pointing his wand at the ferret again. It flew 10 feet into the air, fell with a smack to the floor, and then bounced upward once more. "I don't like people who attack when their opponent's back's turned," growled Moody as the ferret bounced higher and higher, squealing in pain. "Stinking, cowardly, scummy thing to do." The ferret flew through the air, its legs and tail flailing helplessly. "Never do that again," said Moody, speaking each word as the ferret hit the stone floor and bounced upward again. "Professor Moody," said a shocked voice. Professor McGonagall was coming down the marble staircase with her arms full of books. "Hello, Professor McGonagall," said Moody calmly, bouncing the ferret still higher. What are you doing?" said Professor McGonagall, her eyes following the bouncing ferret's progress through the air. Teaching, said Moody. Teach Moody, is that a student? Shrieked Professor McGonagall, the book spilling out of her arms. Yep, said Moody. No, cried Professor McGonagall, running down the stairs and pulling out her wand. A moment later, with a loud snapping noise, Draco Malfoy had reappeared, lying in a heap on the floor with his sleek blonde hair all over his now brilliantly pink face. He got to his feet, wincing. Moody, Weniveru's transfiguration as a punishment, said Professor McGonagall firmly. Surely Professor Dumbledore told you that. He might have mentioned it, yeah, said Moody, scratching his chin unconcernedly, but I thought a good sharp shock. We give detentions, Moody. Or speak to the offender's head of house. I'll do that then, said Moody, staring at Malfoy with great dislike. Malfoy, whose pale eyes were still watering with pain and humiliation, looked malevolently up at Moody and muttered something in which the words, my father, were distinguishable. Oh, yeah, said Moody quietly, limping forward a few steps, the Dulclan, his wooden leg echoing around the hall. Well, I know your father of old, boy. You tell him Moody's keeping a close eye on his son. You tell him that from me. Now your head of house'll be Snape, will it? Yes, said Malfoy resentfully. Another old friend, growled Moody. I've been looking forward to a chat with old Snape. Come on, you. And he seized Malfoy's upper arm and marched him off toward the dungeons. Professor McGonagall stared anxiously after them for a few moments, then waved her wand at her fallen books, causing them to soar up into the air and back into her arms. That was brilliant, Tracy said as they sat down at the Slytherin table a few minutes later, surrounded by excited talk on all sides about what had just happened. Draco Malfoy, the amazing bouncing ferret. Violet, whose hands were shaking, tried very hard to take a sip of pumpkin juice without spilling it all over herself. Yeah, she muttered. Brilliant. Are you all right? Malfoy's spell missed you, didn't it? Said Tracy, leaning in with concern in her eyes. I'm fine, said Violet quickly. He didn't get me. You don't look fine, said Cassius, watching her from across the table. You're trembling, Violet. It's nothing, Violet said, flushing. Then, what did Moody mean that Snape was another old friend? Did they used to work together? Cass snorted. I doubt it. It didn't sound like Moody thinks very highly of him, did it? I'm more interested to hear how he knows Malfoy's father, said Tracy conspiratorially. I mean, all I've ever heard about the Malfoys is how rotten they are. Moody talked like he knew about all that firsthand. The Malfoys are rotten, Cass said. It's about time at least one of them faced some consequences for their actions. He didn't deserve that, Violet said quietly. Both Cass and Tracy stared at her. What are you talking about? Cassius said in disbelief. He tried to hex you when your back was turned. And I could have handled it and gotten him back, said Violet, or Harry would have taken care of it. Moody shouldn't have transfigured him like that. I'd have thought you'd love that, said Tracy, surprised. Yow hate Malf, Roman 6. Yeah, I do. I just don't think it's funny when someone can't fight back. An uncomfortable silence fell between the three of them. Violet shoved a forkful of roast beef into her mouth and glanced up to the high table. Moody was noticeably absent, as was Professor Snape. Professor McGonagall was just slipping into her seat, her face more pinched than usual. Violet didn't have defense against the dark arts class until Thursday. She wasn't looking forward to it. Chapter 10. The Unforgivable Curses. The next 2 days passed without great incident, unless you counted Neville Longbottom melting his 6th cauldron. Professor Snape, who seemed to have attained new levels of vindictiveness over the summer, gave Neville detention and issued a series of dire threats to the rest of the class, should anyone be foolish enough to follow in Neville's footsteps. Professor Snape didn't say a word to Violet until the very end of the lesson. She had almost made it to the door, breath held, when he called her back. Due to this year's festivities, my time outside of class will be even more of a commodity than usual, he said, narrowing his eyes at the contents of a sample vial as he held it up to the light. As such, your lessons will lack a specific schedule. I'll send word when I have time for you, Miss Potter. Genuine surprise, and no small amount of panic, lanced through Violet's insides at these words. After last year's ordeal with Sirius, she had expected Professor Snape to forego her private potions lessons out of spite, and had already mentally mourned the loss of them. But did she really want to spend hours alone in Snape's company after witnessing his meltdown in the hospital wing? When she didn't respond right away, Professor Snape's black eyes flicked in her direction. The burning fury she'd seen that night was gone from their depths, but Violet still couldn't help but flinch. "Yes, sir." "Thank you, sir," she managed to squeak out, and hurried off to herbology with an uncomfortable churning in her stomach. Fortunately, Violet didn't have to worry about running into Professor Snape. At all the next day he was absent from school, having been called to testify with Professor Dumbledore at Sirius Black's trial. Violet and Harry watched the skies anxiously as the morning post arrived on Thursday, looking out for the shape of Hedwig carrying word from Sirius himself. But there was no sign of the snowy white owl among the flutter of grey and brown. When a copy of Thedily Prophet was finally borrowed, all it said on the subject of the trial was that it was ongoing. This did nothing to ease Violet's nerves. Last time she and Harry had heard from Sirius, he'd spoken of the trial like it was nothing more than a formality being put on, so the ministry didn't look completely incompetent by pardoning him outright. But even if they were regging a serious trial, Sirius was an innocent man. Surely the ministry would see that and let him go. Unless, of course, Snape spoke up and tried to discredit him. At the end of last year, it hadn't seemed to matter a whit to him that Sirius was innocent and had been wrongfully imprisoned for over a decade. His hatred for Sirius, which was at least as strong as Sirius' hatred for him, had been so blinding that he'd refused to believe the truth about Scabbers until Pettigrew was forced to transform right before his eyes. And even then, Snape had screamed to everyone present that Sirius was in cahoots with Pettigrew to clear his own name and deserved to be sent back to Azkaban. Violet very badly wanted to believe that his testimony would help to set Sirius free. Professor Snape Wasser, he saw and heard everything that she had. If he told the truth, then the ministry would have no choice but to let Sirius go. And she wanted, a little desperately, for Professor Snape to do the right thing. Violet had spent too many years looking up to the man and defending him against her brother's ire. It would be a terrible disappointment if it turned out that Harry was right about him all along. But Violet wasn't the only one feeling stressed and uncertain that morning. There was a palpable tension in the air as the Slytherin fourth years queued up outside of Moody's classroom on Thursday morning. Malfoy was looking particularly on edge. No small wonder, considering his last encounter with Professor Moody. When the bell rang, the back rows filled up quickly, with Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle sitting as far from Moody's desk as possible. In order to sit together, Violet and Tracy were forced to take the two seats right in front of it. They took out their copies of Dark Forces, a guide to self-protection, and waited, unusually quiet. Soon they heard Moody's distinctive clunking footsteps coming down the corridor, and he entered the room, looking as strange and frightening as ever. They could just see his clawed wooden foot protruding underneath his robes. "You can put those away," he growled, stumping over to his desk and sitting down. "Those books, you won't need them." They returned the books to their bags, Tracy looking excited. Moody took out a register, shook his long mane of grizzled hair out of his twisted and scarred face, and began to call out names, his normal eye moving steadily down the list while his magical eye swiveled around, fixing upon each student as they answered. His gaze lingered pointedly on certain students. Malfoy got the longest glare, but Theodore Nott and Susanna Runcorn seemed to hold his attention as well, as though he were trying to memorize their faces. "Right then," he said, when the last person had declared themselves present. "I've had a few words with Professor Lupin about this class. Seems you have a pretty thorough grounding in tackling dark creatures. You've covered boggarts, red caps, hinkerpunks, grindelows, kappas, and werewolves. Is that right?" There was a general murmur of assent. But you're behind, very behind on dealing with curses, said Moody. So I'm here to bring you up to scratch on what wizards can do to each other. I've got 1 year to teach how to deal with dark. What, you aren't staying? Tracy blurted out. Moody's magical eye spun around to stare at Tracy. Tracy looked extremely apprehensive, but after a moment, Moody smiled the first time Violet had seen him do so. The effect was to make his heavily scarred face look more twisted and contorted than ever, but it was nevertheless good to know that he ever did anything as friendly as smile. Tracy looked deeply relieved. Davis, was it? Moody said. Yeah, I'm staying just the 1 year. Special favor to Dumbledore, 1 year, and then back to my quiet retirement. He gave a harsh laugh and then clapped his gnarled hands together. So straight into it. Curses, they come in many strengths and forms. Now, according to the Ministry of Magic, I'm supposed to teach you counter curses and leave it at that. I'm not supposed to show you what illegal dark curses look like until you're in the 6th year. You're not supposed to be old enough to deal with it till then. But Professor Dumbledore's got a higher opinion of your nerves, and I say, the sooner you know what you're up against, the better. How are you supposed to defend yourself against something you've never seen? A wizard who's about to put an illegal curse on you isn't going to tell you what he's about to do. He's not going to do it nice and polite to your face, though some of you might be familiar with that tactic. Moody's magical eye swiveled in Violet's direction and then toward the back of the room where Malfoy sat. An uncomfortable beat of silence hung in the air. So, do any of you know which curses are most heavily punished by wizarding law? Several hands rose tentatively into the air. Violet raised hers a few inches off her desk. Moody pointed at Blaise Zabini, though his eye was still fixed at the back of the room. There's the Imperious Curse, Blaise said quietly. Ah, yes, said Moody appreciatively. Good old Imperious Curse. Gave the Ministry a lot of trouble at one time. Moody got heavily to his mismatched feet, opened his desk drawer, and took out a glass jar. 3 large black spiders were scuttling around inside it. Violet felt Tracy recoil slightly next to her. Tracy hated insects and creepy crawlies of all kinds. Moody reached into the jar, caught one of the spiders, and held it in the palm of his hand so that they could all see it. He then pointed his wand at it and muttered, Imperio. The spider leapt from Moody's hand on a fine thread of silk and began to swing backward and forward as though on a trapeze. It stretched out its legs rigidly, then did a backflip, breaking the thread and landing on the desk, where it began to cartwheel in circles. Moody jerked her wand, and the spider rose onto 2 of its hind legs and went into what was unmistakable a tap dance. A few people were laughing. Moody was not. Think it's funny, do you? He growled. You'd like it, would you, if I did it to you? The laughter died away almost instantly. Total control, said Moody quietly as the spider balled itself up and began to roll over and over. I could make it jump out of the window, drown itself, throw itself down one of your throats. Tracy shuddered. The hairs were standing up on the back of Violet's neck. Years back, there were a lot of witches and wizards being controlled by the Imperious Curse, said Moody, and Violet knew he was talking about the days in which Voldemort had been all-powerful. Some job for the Ministry, trying to sort out who was being forced to act and who was acting of their own free will. Both of Moody's eyes now settled on Malfoy, who had been watching the spider with undisguised fascination. Everyone in the room knew about the Malfoy family's involvement with Voldemort and knew that they had denied being in control of their actions at the time, which allowed them to walk free rather than spending the rest of their days in a cell in Azkaban. Draco Malfoy's eyes left the spider and locked with Moody's, which was still watching him. His pale face went a blotchy sort of pink. The Imperious Curse can be fought, Moody said, looking back to the spider, and I'll be teaching you how, but it takes real strength of character, and not everyone's got it. Better avoid being hit with it if you can. Constant vigilance, he barked, and everyone jumped. Moody picked up the somersaulting spider and threw it back into the jar. Anyone else know one? Another illegal curse? To Violet's immense surprise, both Crabbe and Goyle raised their hands. She'd never seen either of them do this before. "Yes," said Moody, pointing at Crabbe. "Cruciatus curse," Crabbe grunted firmly. Moody was looking very intently at Crabbe, again with both of his eyes. After a moment, he turned his back to the class, reached into the jar for the next spider and placed it upon the desktop, where it remained motionless, apparently too scared to move. "The Cruciatus curse," said Moody. "Needs to be a bit bigger for you to get the idea," he said, pointing his wand at the spider. Engorgio, the spider swelled. It was now larger than a tarantula. Tracy let out an audible squeak and pushed her chair back away from Moody's desk. Moody raised his wand again, pointed at the spider, and muttered, "Crucio." At once, the spider's legs bent in upon its body. It rolled over and began to twitch horrible, rocking from side to side. No sound came from it, but Violet was sure that if it could have given voice, it would have been screaming. Moody did not remove his wand, and the spider started to shudder and jerk more violently. It was thrashing now, its 8 legs twitching and flailing uncontrollably on top of Moody's desk. The room was completely silent. Violet couldn't make herself look away, no matter how badly she wanted to. At last, after what felt like ages, Moody relented. He raised his wand. The spider's legs relaxed, but it continued to twitch. "Reducio," Moody muttered, and the spider shrank back to its proper size. He put it back into the jar. "Pain," said Moody softly. "You don't need thumbscrews or knives to torture someone if you can perform the Cruciatus curse. That one was very popular once, too." "Right. Anyone know any others?" Violet looked around. From the looks on everyone's faces, she guessed they were all wondering what was going to happen to the last spider. Draco Malfoy lifted his hand high into the air. Moody pointed to him, and Malfoy said, coolly, "Avada Kedavra." Several people looked uneasily around at him. "Ah," said Moody, another slight smile twisting his lopsided mouth, though there was no light in his eyes as he looked at Malfoy. "Yes, the last and worst. Avada Kedavra. The killing curse." He put his hand into the glass jar, and almost as though it knew what was coming, the third spider scuttled frantically around the bottom of the jar, trying to evade Moody's fingers, but he trapped it and placed it upon the desktop. It started to scuttle frantically across the wooden surface. Moody raised his wand, and Violet felt a sudden thrill of foreboding. "Avada Kedavra," Moody roared. There was a flash of blinding green light and a rushing sound, as though a vast, invisible something was soaring through the air instantaneously. The spider rolled over onto its back, unmarked, but unmistakably dead. Several of the students stifled cries. Tracy hands flew up to cover her mouth as the spider skidded toward them. Moody swept the dead spider off the desk onto the floor. "Not nice," he said calmly. "Not pleasant, and there's no counter-curse. There's no blocking it. Only one known person has ever survived it, and his sister's sitting right in front of me." Violet felt her face redden as Moody's eyes, both of them, looked into her own. She could feel everyone else looking around at her too. Violet stared down at the wooden surface of her desk, willing herself to breath in and out. So that was that her parents had died. Exactly like that spider. Had they been unblemished and unmarked too? Had they simply seen the flash of green, the same flash that had haunted Violet and Harry's nightmares for as long as they could remember, and heard the rush of speeding death, before life was wiped from their bodies? Violet had been picturing her parents' deaths over and over again for 3 years now, ever since she and Harry had found out they had been murdered, ever since she'd found out what had happened that night. How Peter Pettigrew had betrayed their parents' whereabouts to Voldemort, who had come to find them at their cottage. How Voldemort had killed their father first. How James Potter had tried to hold him off while he shouted at his wife to take Harry and Violet and run. Voldemort had advanced on Lily Potter, told her to move aside so that he could kill Harry. How she'd begged him to kill her instead, refused to stop shielding her children. And so Voldemort had murdered her too, before turning his wand on Harry. Violet knew these details because she and Harry had heard their parents' voices when they had fought the Dementors last year. For that was the terrible power of the Dementors, to force their victims to relive the worst memories of their lives and drown, powerless, in their own despair. A droplet of water splashed onto the surface of the desk, breaking her concentration, and Violet realized that she was crying. With a massive effort, she pulled herself back to the present and wiped her face with the sleeve of her robes. Moody was speaking again, from a great distance it seemed, and she struggled to listen to what he was saying. The killing curse is one that needs a powerful bit of magic behind it. You could get all your wands out now and point them at me and say the words, and I doubt I'd get so much as a nosebleed. But that doesn't matter. I'm not here to teach you how to do it. Now, if there's no known counter curse, why I am showing you, because you've got to know, you've got to appreciate what the worst did. You don't want to find yourself in a situation where you're facing it. Constant vigilance, he roared, and the whole class jumped again. Now, those three curses, the killing curse, imperius, and cruciatus, are known as the unforgivable curses. The use of any of them on a fellow human being is enough to earn a life sentence in Azkaban. That's what you're up against. That's what I've got to teach you to fight. You need preparing. You need arming. But most of all, you need to practice constant, never-ceasing vigilance. Get out your quills. Copy this down. They spent the rest of the lesson taking notes on each of the unforgivable curses. No one spoke until the bell rang, but when Moody had dismissed them, and they had left the classroom, a torrent of talk burst forth. Most people were discussing the curses in awed voices. Did you see it twitch? And when he killed it just like that? They were talking about the lesson, Violet thought it had been some sort of spectacular show, but she hadn't found it very entertaining. That was horrifying, said Tracy to Violet as they set off toward the Great Hall. I've never seen anything like that. I didn't even know magic could have that. When he killed the spider, the way it just did, snuffed right out like. But Tracy fell suddenly silent at the look on Violet's face and didn't speak again until they reached the Great Hall, when she greeted Cassius. What's the matter with you? Cass asked Violet, slumping heavily into the seat across from her. We've just had Moody's class, Tracy answered, which Violet was grateful for. She didn't quite feel like speaking just yet. He showed us all the horrible curses. Said we need to be prepared for what's out there. What, he did the whole unforgivable show, Cass said, sounding appalled. Toyu, but you're fourth years. You aren't meant to be taught about that sort of thing yet. He said Dumbledore thought we could handle it, Tracy shrugged. Cassius pointed at Violet. Does she look like she's handling it to you? I'm fine, Violet said quickly. Sorry, I was just Violet's voice faltered. She couldn't even come up with an excuse, not that she needed to. Both Cass and Tracy were now looking at her in concern. You've been crying again, Roman 6, said Cass softly. I can see it on your face. I'll wascree, Violet grumbled. She scrubbed at her eyes again for good measure. So you've seen all the curses then, too? Tracy asked Cassius, leaning across the table. What did you think? And what did you think of Moody as well? Cass's expression shifted from concern to discomfort. It was disgusting, that's what I thought of it, he said gruffly. Not to mention how funny some of the lads in my year found it all. Bowl about fell out of his chair laughing at the imperious curse. And of course, he's too bloody stupid to see the way Moody was looking at him. When he looked at me like that during roll call, I thought I might be sick. Why would Moody give you a dirty look during roll call? Tracy asked. Violet, eyes still stinging slightly, thought she might have seen a furtive sort of blush appear on Cassius' cheeks. Dunno, he said. Maybe he just didn't like my face. Cass snagged a Yorkshire pudding from their golden platter and stuffed it into his mouth. "Gah, gee," he grunted around his morsel, and then in a flash he was gone, hurrying out of the great hall with his pack slung over his shoulder. Tracy stared after him with a frown on her face. Do you ever get the feeling he's hiding something? She said suspiciously. Or is it just me? The rest of the day crawled by for Violet. History of magic was as interesting as it ever was, which was to say not very. Any fascination Violet might have had for the subject of goblin wars was stripped away by the droning, monotonous voice of Professor Binns. By the time they were let out and dinner rolled around, Violet was on the verge of falling asleep on her plate. Coming out of the great hall on her way back to the Slytherin common room, Violet was stopped by none other than Professor Lupin, looking unusually energetic. "Glad I caught you, Violet," Lupin said, ushering her aside from the flow of students streaming from the hall. "I've just been to see Professor Dumbledore. He'd like to have a word with you and Harry before you head off to bed." "Are we in trouble?" Violet asked at once, a sinking feeling in her heart. "Did Harry do something already?" Lupin laughed, a genuine sound that woke Violet up a bit more. She couldn't remember ever seeing him this cheerful. "Neither of you is being punished, I'll leave it at that," he said evasively. "Ah, here comes Harry now. Harry. Over here, please." Harry looked around for the source of his name and brightened at once when he caught sight of Professor Lupin. He turned and spoke to Ron and Hermione, and for a moment Violet feared they meant to come with him, but the two of them merely waved and headed off up the marble staircase, while Harry fought his way over to where Violet and Lupin stood. "Hey, Roman 6, he said. "Hello, sir." "Hello, Harry," said Lupin brightly. "Would you come with me, please?" Sharing looks of bewilderment, the twins had little choice but to follow as Professor Lupin led them up the grand staircase toward Dumbledore's office. "Are we in trouble?" Harry whispered to Violet once he realized where they were headed. Violet shook her head. "He said Dumbledore wants to talk to us," Violet whispered back. She jumped when Professor Lupin said, "You really aren't in trouble, I promise." "Then what's going on?" Harry asked boldly. "Is something the matter?" Professor Lupin shot them a smile over his shoulder. "You'll see." Anxiety and suspicion had well taken root in Violet's stomach by the time they reached the great oaken doors that led into Professor Dumbledore's office. Lupin raised a fist and rapped smartly, and a voice from within called for them to enter. Giving the twins one final, mischievous smile, Professor Lupin pushed open the doors and led them inside. Dumbledore's office looked much the same as it had the previous times that Violet had had occasion to visit it. The portraits of headmasters past stared down at her from the walls above, while the floor was filled with little tables with strange little silver instruments ticking and whirring away on them. Behind his massive claw-footed desk sat Professor Dumbledore himself, smiling beneath his drooping silver mustache. And there, in the middle of the room, stood Sirius Black. "Sirius," Violet heard her brother breathe as the pair of them stood there in shock. "Sirius." Harry ran forward, arms outstretched, and was swept into a hug by his godfather. Sirius was laughing, a warm, rich sound that was so unlike the hollow barks that he'd let out the last time they had seen him, dressed in filthy rags in the shrieking shack. His face, still thin but no longer a skull-like mask, was alight with a radiant smile. He looked, more than he ever had before, like the best man standing in their parents' wedding photograph, beaming into the camera next to their father. "What are you doing here?" Harry demanded, staggering back in shock when he and Sirius finally broke apart. "The ministry, the trial, it's all over," Sirius said, grinning. "The hearing ended an hour ago. They haven't even released a statement yet, but it's all over now. I'm a free man, Harry." Over Harry's shoulder, Sirius caught sight of Violet standing there and gaping at him. He held out his arms once more. "Hello, Violet," he said, and in a flash, Violet had crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him as well. He was very thin beneath his robes, thinner than Lupin even, but his arms were strong and his hug was warm. The wiry bristles of his beard scratched against the side of Violet's head, the way Hagrid's did when he bent down to hug her properly. It was a very comforting feeling, and Violet at once began to cry. "I'm sorry," Sirius said, releasing her at once in alarm. "Sorry, did I squeeze too hard?" "Are you all right?" "It's fine," Violet hiccuped, immediately wiping her cheeks to try and stem the flow of tears. I cry a lot, sorry," still looking worried. Sirius patted her gently on the shoulder. "So long as you're okay." "Did Professor Snape speak at your trial?" Violet asked quickly as she stepped back. Did he tell the truth? He did, shockingly, said Sirius with a snort. Looked like he was having all his fingernails pulled off while he did it, but between him and Professor Dumbledore, they provided enough credible testimony to clear things up. You ought to thank him, Sirius, Lupin said mildly. Sirius rolled his eyes. Yes, yes, you've mentioned that. He turned back to Harry. And how are you holding up, Harry? How have you been sleeping? At once, Harry looked bashful. He glanced nervously between Professor Dumbledore and Sirius, pointed stare and said, fine, thanks. Professor Dumbledore cleared his throat and rose to his feet. I think perhaps the four of you deserve a moment of privacy, said Dumbledore, eyes twinkling in a way that was far too knowing for Violet's liking as he came around his desk. With a casual flick of his wand, 4 cushy-looking armchairs appeared out of thin air. Pardon me, children. Please take as much time as you need in my office. I have little use for it. Both Lupin and Sirius laughed, but the twins shifted uncomfortably. Professor Dumbledore disappeared through a side door with a little backwards wave, and then the guard children were alone with their godfathers. Sirius turned back to Harry, and the genial smile vanished from his face. All right, he said, settling into the nearest armchair. Tell me more about this pain in your scar. What pain? Violet asked, looking sharply at her brother. The one you had this summer. It was nothing, Harry said, face reddening. I mean, it was just a dream. A dream, Sirius repeated. Do your dreams always make your scar hurt? His eyes flicked to Harry's forehead, and Harry immediately reached up to adjust his hair. No, Harry muttered. But it was only the one dream, and my scar hasn't bothered me since, honest. What do you remember about the dream? Professor Lupin asked, lowering himself into an armchair as well and gesturing for Harry and Violet to do the same. Violet did so at once, but Harry looked reluctant. Not much, he said slowly. There was an old man, but I didn't recognize him, and someone else. I think it was. It was Pettigrew, Violet said quietly. Both Lupin and Sirius turned to her very quickly. Peter, Professor Lupin said sharply. Harry, did you dream about Peter? Harry shifted awkwardly in his chair. I suppose, he muttered. Violet remembers it better than I do. Harry told you about this dream as well, Sirius said to Violet. We talked about it, yeah, after we woke up, she answered. I didn't know the old man either, but it was definitely Pettigrew's voice talking. How could you know that? Lupin said, looking confused. It's not that I doubt your memory, Violet, only you seem to remember Harry's dream better than Harry himself. I usually do remember them when I wake up, Violet explained. I mean, I dreamed it too, so I suppose things just stick in my head more clearly. Sirius and Lupin exchanged a significant look. Violet, Sirius said, wetting his lips, do you mean that you and Harry had the same dream? Violet looked to her brother, suddenly nervous. Yes, we always dream together, Harry added quickly. Ever since we can remember. Is that, he looked between Sirius and Professor Lupin. Is that not normal? From the long, stunned sort of look that the two men shared between them, Violet could tell right away that it was absolutely normal. Something that she and Harry had shared and held between them all their lives, and never thought anything of, was apparently so out of the ordinary that even 2 grown wizards were taken aback by it. Is it bad? Violet asked, her voice high with nerves. Lupin and Sirius finally broke their silent stare and looked to her. Lupin even smiled. I admit, I've never heard of anything like it, he said carefully. But then again, I haven't known many sets of twins in my life. It's certainly interesting, but I don't think that there's anything bad about it. Harry said the dream made his scar hurt, said Sirius suddenly. But how did it affect you, Violet? Did you feel any pain at all? A headache? Violet shook her head. No, I've never felt anything like that. Harry's the only one who gets twinges. Both men rounded on Harry once more. You told me in your letter that your scar only hurt you when Voldemort was nearby, Sirius said. Harry, is there anything else you can remember about your dream? You said Wormtail was there. What about the old man? Are you certain you didn't know him? What did he look like? Perhaps if you saw him again you'd be able to. It was just a dream, Harry burst out, now fully red in the face. No, I didn't know the old man, but what does it matter? It was just a dream I had months ago. I know it may not seem important, but if there's anything else, Harry, why does it matter what I dreamt? Harry shouted. I could have dreamed about flying over a rainbow made of candy floss, and it wouldn't have made any more sense. Why are you both taking this so seriously? Lupin and Sirius looked at each other again. Lupin shook his head slightly, and Sirius turned back to Harry. Albus doesn't want me to tell you this, he said quietly, laying a firm hand on Harry's shoulder. But I think you have a right to know about what's going on. Things are happening again. Harry, strange rumors have reached me. Sirius, for heaven's sake, Lupin started, but Sirius kept right on. Bringing Mad-Eye out of retirement is no random whim. Dumbledore is reading the signs, even if no one else is. Sirius, Lupin barked. Sirius let go of Harry and sat up, looking cross. What, Remus? The boys got a right to know. Maybe so, Lupin snapped, but not tonight. Not right now, Sirius. It's late. Harry and Violet must be very tired. We're not, Violet and Harry said at once, but Lupin ignored them. I happen to know they've been given a lot of homework this week, and I imagine they've still quite a lot of it to get done. Children, please, let's head back to your dorms. But we're really not tired, Harry protested as Professor Lupin got to his feet. We want to know what's going on. Sirius, what rumors, what signs? But Sirius had risen to his feet as well, looking slightly abashed. He flashed the twins a tense smile and said, Mooney's right, as usual, I'm afraid. You two should be off to bed at this hour. But Harry looked crestfallen. But you've only just gotten here. I'm not leaving just yet, said Sirius gently. I've still got to have a few words with Dumbledore about where I'm going to be staying. Don't worry, Harry. We'll see each other again soon. There was a series of awkward, slightly resentful hugs, and then Harry and Violet found themselves ushered out of Professor Dumbledore's office and left to head back to their respective common rooms, alone. They descended the rotating staircase together in silence, both tense and full to bursting with questions that neither of them quite had the proper grasp on to put into words. Things were going on. Things were being kept from them. Dumbledore was worried. The way they dreamed wasn't normal. This was a lot to take in at once. The pair of them were so distracted that they didn't even say goodnight to each other before wandering apart. Harry went up, climbing toward Gryffindor Tower, while Violet slouched down into the dungeons and straight into her wading bed without a second thought. Her head was swimming, and yet she fell asleep as soon as her head hit the pillow. Chapter 11. Beauxbatons and Durmstrang. The next morning, word of Sirius Black's acquittal was all over the front page of Thedley Prophetand. It was the only thing people were talking about in the halls. Not even a year earlier, Black was one of the most fierce criminals in the wizarding world and had broken into the school twice and attempted to break into Gryffindor Tower with the goal of, so it was believed, killing Harry. Now he was being lauded as a tragic victim who'd been swept up in the Ministry's aggressive campaign against dark magic. The finer details such as Scabbers the Rats and Crookshank's involvement were kept from the public, but the blame for Sirius's former crimes had been shifted to their rightful perpetrator. A nervous, watery-eyed photograph of a much younger Peter Pettigrew stared back at Violet from the newspaper, looking just as desperate and rat-like as he had the night he'd been revealed to her and Harry. And she recalled with a shudder in their shared dream. Another fact obscured from the public was the fact that Sirius Black was Harry's godfather. Unfortunately, there were already certain people who knew this truth and had a lot of questions about it. Are you going to go and live with him? Ron had demanded of Harry, eyes wide as he brandished a copy of The Prophet. Do you think I'll be able to come and visit you for a change? I don't know, Harry answered truthfully. We didn't get a chance to talk about it. Harry had, of course, told Ron and Hermione everything about their brief meeting with Sirius in Dumbledore's office, including the details of his and Violet's dreaming habits. Violet had told Cass and Tracy about the meeting as well, though held back on the specifics, as usual. She'd already had this conversation with them the previous night. While it would be wonderful to go and live with Sirius to live with Anione besides Aunt Petunia and Dudley, they had no idea if they would actually be allowed Tartathat. Violet did her best not to dwell on the idea over the next couple of weeks. True, she would sometimes catch herself fantasizing about being allowed to sleep in her own bed, maybe even in her own room, and waking up knowing that she was in a home full of people who loved her. But these visions were quickly shaken off. It didn't do to dwell on uncertainties, especially not when reality, meaning their lessons, was becoming more difficult and demanding than ever before, particularly Moody's defense against the dark arts. To their shock, Professor Moody had announced that he would be putting the Imperious Curse on each of them in turn, to demonstrate its power and to see whether they could resist its effects. "Didn't you say this is illegal, sir?" asked Blaise Zabini uncertainly, as Moody cleared away the desks with a sweep of his wand, leaving a large, clear space in the middle of the room. "You told us that to use it on another person was Dumbledore wants you taught what it feels like," Moody said, his magical eye swiveling to Blaise and fixing him with an eerie, unblinking stare. "If you'd rather learn the hard way when someone's putting it on you so they can control you completely fine by you're excused. Off you go." He pointed one gnarled finger toward the door. Blaise's narrow eyes narrowed even further, but he stayed put. No one else moved to leave, either. Moody began to beckon students forward in turn and put the Imperious Curse upon them. Violet watched as, one by one, her classmates did the most extraordinary things under its influence. Theodore Nut hopped 3 times around the room, singing the national anthem. Pansy Parkinson imitated a squirrel. Goyle performed a series of quite astonishing gymnastics he would certainly not have been capable of in his normal state. Draco Malfoy, after looking very confident when his turn was called, ended up doing several laps around the classroom while walking on his hands, and only stopped with his shaking arms gave out beneath him. Not one of them seemed to be able to fight off the curse, and each of them recovered only when Moody had removed it. "Potter," Moody growled, "you next." This was the moment that Violet had been dreading, to have her mind taken from her. To be under another person's complete control sounded like a waking nightmare of the highest degree. Feeling sick, Violet moved forward into the middle of the classroom, into the space that Moody had cleared of desks. Moody raised his wand, pointed it at Violet, and said, "Imperio." It was such an unexpectedly pleasant sensation that Violet quite forgot how afraid she was. She was floating, as every thought and worry in her head was wiped gently away, leaving nothing but a vague, untraceable happiness. She stood there, suddenly relaxed, only dimly aware of everyone watching her. And then she heard Mad-Eye Moody's voice, echoing in some distant chamber of her empty brain, "Do a pirouette. Do a pirouette." Violet's arms began to lift from her sides, raising out in front of her. "Do a pirouette." But the foreign voice in her mind had woken another in the back of her brain. "I don't want to," said the new voice. "Do a pirouette." "I don't want to do that," said the other voice rather firmly. "I'm not going to spin now." The muscles in Violet's right leg spasmed, and she raised onto her tiptoes and then rocked back onto her heels and lost her balance. She wheeled backward until she collided with the desk behind her. "Now that's more like it," growled Moody's voice, and suddenly Violet felt the empty, echoing feeling in her head disappear. She remembered exactly what was happening, and the sickness returned full force. "Look at that, you lot. Potter fought, she fought it, and she damn near beat it. We'll try that again, Potter, and the rest of you. Pay attention, watch her eyes. That's where you see it. Very good, Miss Potter, very good indeed. They'll have trouble controlling you." "The way he talks," Tracy muttered, as they wandered out of the defense against the dark arts class. An hour later, Moody had insisted on putting Violet through her paces another 3 times in a row, until Violet could throw off the curse entirely. "You would think we're all about to be attacked any second." "I know," said Violet, who was walking very stiffly. Her legs ached from all the near dancing Moody had almost forced her to do, and her jaw felt permanently clenched. And it makes me even more worried that Professor Dumbledore is allowing all this, like he thinks we need to be ready for it too, you know. That is worrying, Tracy said. She was still skipping on every alternate step. She'd had much more difficult with the curse than Violet, though Moody assured her the effects would wear off by lunchtime. And I believe her, gave us even more reading to do after all that. When are we meant to have time for it? All the fourth years had noticed a definite increase in the amount of work they were required to do this term. Professor McGonagall explained why, when the class gave a particularly loud groan at the amount of transfiguration homework she had assigned. You are now entering a most important phase of your magical education, she told them, her eyes glinting dangerously behind her square spectacles. Your ordinary wizarding levels are drawing closer, but we don't take OWLS till fifth year, said Pansy indignantly. Maybe so, Miss Parkinson, but believe me, you need all the preparation you can get. Miss Potter remains the only person in this class who has managed to turn a hedgehog into a satisfactory pincushion. I might remind you Thatia pincushion, Parkinson, still curls up in fright if anyone approaches it with a pin. Pansy shot a murderous look at Violet, who was red-faced and trying to sink beneath her desk before anyone could see how pleased she looked with herself. Her mood improved greatly in Professor Lupin's class. He had invited a real goblin to come and speak to the class and answer any questions they might be brave enough to ask him. It was a very interesting and informative lesson, though the way the goblin's many sharp little teeth glinted out from beneath his lips still sent chills up Violet's spine. Meanwhile, Professor Binns, the ghost who taught history of magic, had them writing weekly essays on the goblin rebellions of the 18th century, which was far easier for those who had heard the goblin's version of events. Professor Flitwick, who was usually quite easygoing, had asked them to read 3 extra books in preparation for their lesson on summoning charms. Professor Snape was forcing them to research antidotes. Everyone took this one seriously, as he had hinted that he might be poisoning one of them before Christmas to see if their antidote worked. Neville was plainly terrified that it was going to him, but most people's bets were on Harry. Since Sirius' trial and pardon, Snape had been even more sour and abusive toward Harry than usual. He had also not yet called upon Violet for her first private lesson, as he said he would, and she was beginning to worry that he had changed his mind. Not that she had the time to worry. Even Hagrid was adding to their workload. The blast-ended Scroots were growing at a remarkable pace, given that nobody had yet discovered what they ate. Hagrid was delighted, and as part of their project, suggested that they come down to his hut on alternate evenings to observe the Scroots and make notes on their extraordinary behavior. I will not, said Draco Malfoy flatly, when Hagrid had proposed this with the air of Father Christmas pulling an extra-large toy out of his sack. I see enough of these foul things during lessons, thanks. Hagrid's smile faded off his face. Ye'll do as you're told, he growled, or I'll be talking a leaf out of Professor Moody's book. I hear ye make a good ferret, Malfoy. Most everybody roared with laughter. Malfoy flushed with anger, but apparently the memory of Moody's punishment was still sufficiently painful to stop him from retorting. Tracy and Violet returned to the castle at the end of the lesson in mixed spirits, while seeing Hagrid put down Malfoy was particularly satisfying, especially because Malfoy had done his very best to get Hagrid sacked the previous year. Violet still felt uncomfortable with the memory of Malfoy's helplessness. When the girls met up with Cass in the entrance hall, they found themselves unable to proceed owing to the large crowd of students congregated there, all milling around a large sign that had been erected at the foot of the marble staircase. Cassius, the tallest of the 3, had no difficulty seeing over the heads in front of them and read the sign aloud to the other 2. The Triwizard Tournament, the delegations from Beauxbatons and Durmstrang, will be arriving at 6 o'clock on Friday the 30th of October. Lessons will end half an hour early. Brilliant, said Tracy. We've got potions last thing on Friday. Snape won't have time to poison your brother. Students will return their bags and books to their dormitories and assemble in front of the castle to greet out guests before the welcoming feast. Only a week away, said Ernie Macmillan of Hufflepuff, emerging from the crowd, his eyes gleaming. I wonder if Cedric knows. Think I'll go and tell him. Cedric, said Tracy, perking up as Ernie hurried off. Cedric Diggory. Do you think he'll be entering the tournament? That oaf, Hogwarts champion, said Cass as they pushed their way through the chattering crowd toward the dungeons. He's not an oaf, Tracy protested. He's really good at Quidditch. He even beat Harry one year, remember? And Sir Prefect, she spoke as though this settled the matter. Cass rolled his eyes. He is 2-0 if I have half my classes with him this year. All he has to do is bat his eyelashes at the teachers, and they're happy to give him the highest marks in the world. Besides, you only like him because he's handsome. I don't like him, Tracy said shrilly, cheeks darkening further. And even if I did, it wouldn't just be because he's handsome. Whatever you say, Cass muttered, smirking. Tracy fumed and ignored him for the rest of the evening. The appearance of the sign in the entrance hall had a marked effect upon the inhabitants of the castle. During the following week, there seemed to be only one topic of conversation, no matter where Violet went: the Triwizard Tournament. Rumors were flying from student to student like highly contagious germs. Who was going to try for Hogwarts champion, what the tournament would involve, how the students from Beauxbatons of Durmstrang differed from themselves. Violet noticed, too, that the castle seemed to be undergoing an extra thorough cleaning. Several grimy portraits had been scrubbed, much to the displeasure of their subjects, who sat huddled in their frames and wincing as they felt their raw pink faces. The suits of armor were suddenly gleaming and moving without squeaking, and Argus Filch, the caretaker, was behaving so ferociously to any students who forgot to wipe their shoes that he terrified a pair of first-year girls into hysterics. When they went down to breakfast on the morning of the 30th of October, they found that the Great Hall had been decorated overnight. Enormous silk banners hung from the walls, each of them representing a Hogwarts house: red with a gold lion for Gryffindor, blue with a bronze eagle for Ravenclaw, yellow with a black badger for Hufflepuff, and green with a silver serpent for Slytherin. Behind the teacher's table, the largest banner of all bore the Hogwarts coat of arms. Lion, eagle, badger, and snake united around a large H. When Violet joined her friends at the Slytherin table, she noticed a large badge pinned to the front of Tracy's robes. What's that? She asked, nodding to it. I bought it from Granger, Tracy said, turning to show the badge's face to Violet. She's selling them for 2 sickles. Spew, Violet read aloud, wrinkling her nose. Why's Hermione selling badges that say spew? It's supposed to be SBW, Tracy said defensively, for the Society for the Promotion of Elvish Welfare. She told me all about it, Violet. Did you know that Hogwarts Hash-and-Dreads have house elves living in it? What? Said Violet, stunned. Isn't it horrible? They do all of the cooking and all the cleaning in the dorms and common rooms. I had no idea until Hermione told me about it. I've never even seen one of them in the school, have you? Violet shook her head. No, I haven't. I just thought it all got done by magic. So did I, but it turns out it's actually being done by slaves. Oh, not this again. Cass slid into the seat on Tracy's other side, looking distastefully at her SPEW badge. Tracy stuck out her chin defiantly and said, Yes, Cassius, this again. Did you know that Hogwarts is being run on slave labor? No, and I don't care, said Cass blithely. Pass the orange juice, please. How much did you say that badge cost? Violet asked quickly. 2 sickles, Tracy said through clenched teeth. She rounded on Cass, but Violet left the table before she could really lay into him. Across the hall, Hermione was sitting with Harry and Ron at the Gryffindor table, with Fred and George huddled together nearby. Violet plopped herself unceremoniously between Fred and Hermione. I'd like to buy one of your badges, please, she said brightly. Hermione's face lit up. Really? I mean, of course, hang on, let me just. She reached into pockets and pulled out 2 handfuls of brightly colored buttons, each bearing the letters SPW written across them in bold black letters. I have loads of them left, because some people don't know how to make a good sales pitch. Hermione looked pointedly at Ron and Harry, who both scowled and shrank away from her accusatory glare. Look, we bought your bloody badges, didn't we? Ron grumbled. Just because we don't go around harassing people about it like you do. It's called raising support for the cause, Hermione said hotly, as Violet picked out a bright orange SPEW badge and pinned it to the front of her robes. Something the pair of you need to be doing, as members of the Society for the Promotion of Elvish Welfare. Doesn't it bother you, knowing that there are slaves cooking all of your meals and making your bed for you every morning? Ron now rolled his eyes at the ceiling, which was flooding them all in autumn sunlight, and Harry became extremely interested in his bacon. Violet couldn't help but notice that neither of them were wearing their badges. George, however, leaned in toward Violet and Hermione. Listen, have you two ever been down in the kitchens? No, of course not, said Hermione curtly. I hardly think students are supposed to. Well, we have, said George, indicating Fred, loads of times to nick food. And we've met them, and they're happy. They think they've got the best job in the world. That's because they're uneducated and brainwashed. Hermione began hotly, but her next few words were drowned out by the sudden whooshing noise from overhead, which announced the arrival of the post owls. Hedwig fluttered down and landed on Harry's shoulder, a letter attached to her leg. Hermione immediately stopped talking and joined Ron in reading over Harry's shoulder. Violet's attention, however, was caught by Fred and George muttering to one another, speaking quietly as though they didn't want to be overheard. What are you two up to? Violet asked, scooting closer to Fred. He put a hand to his chest in mock offense. Us, up to something. I dunno what you're on about. I, for one, am hurt by your suspicion, said George, putting on an impressive pout. Can't two people simply talk to each other without being involved in nefarious plots? Naughty Utwo, Violet teased, and they both grinned. So what's going on? Haven't you heard? Said Fred. Blimey, it's been all over the school, the Triwizard Tournament, that's what's going on, said George. Are you planning on trying out to enter it? Violet asked. I didn't think you'd be old enough. We're not yet, George said, his smile dropping. But we're working on that. I asked McGonagall how the champions are chosen, but she wasn't telling. And no one's got a clue what the tasks are going to be, said Fred thoughtfully. Sure, there's loads of theories, but they're all rubbish as far as we can tell. His expression turned sly. Bet Warrington would love to know what the tournament has in store. Cass, said Violet, surprised. Why should he care? Why wouldn't he? Said Fred. I heard he's got his mind made up about having a go at it. Having a hint or two about the challenges would be a great head start. He hasn't said anything to me about trying out. Violet frowned. Fred shrugged and said, he hasn't said anything to me either, not that he would, but word gets around for us upperclassmen. Angelina's trying out as well, for sure. Interesting, said Violet, though she wasn't really paying attention any longer. Thanks for telling me, Fred, she muttered, rising to her feet. Good luck on the mischief, you two. She rejoined her friends at the Slytherin table, though her plans for badgering Cass about his entering the Triwizard Tournament were shelved for the moment. Whatever had passed between him and Tracy, while Violet was gone, had left them both silently fuming, not speaking to her or each other. Other than that, there was a pleasant feeling of anticipation in the air that day. Nobody was attentive in lessons, being more interested in the arrival that evening of the people from Beauxbatons and Durmstrang. As potions was half an hour shorter than usual, Violet didn't get a change to ask Professor Snape about the start of her private lessons. When the bell rang early, all the Slytherins hurried down the hall to their common room, deposited their bags and books as they had been instructed, pulled on their cloaks, and rushed back downstairs into the entrance hall. The heads of houses were ordering their students into lines. Malfoy, straighten your hat, Professor Snape snapped at Draco. Potter, Davis, take those ridiculous badges off. But sir, Tracy protested, they're for take them off. There was no arguing with Snape's tone. Sullenly, Violet and Tracy removed their SPEW. badges and tucked them into their pockets. "Follow me," Professor Snape ordered. "First year's in front. Anyone seen pushing will be in detention from now until Christmas." They filed down the steps and lined up in front of the castle. It was a cold, clear evening. Dusk was falling, and a pale, transparent-looking full moon was already shining over the forbidden forest. Professor Lupin was conspicuously absent from the staff lineup. "It's nearly 6, said Tracy, checking her wrist watch and then staring down the drive that led to the front gates. "How do you think they'll be coming? Not the train, surely." "Probably not," said Violet. "They can't be traveling by broomstick, not from that far away." "Maybe they're taking a portkey, or they could apparate," said Tracy excitedly. "Maybe you're allowed to do it under 17 wherever they come from. You can't apparate inside the Hogwarts grounds, though." Violet mumbled, craning her neck to try and get a better look down the lane. They scanned the darkening grounds excitedly, but nothing was moving. Everything was still, silent, and quite as usual. Violet was starting to feel cold. She wished they'd hurry up. Maybe the foreign students were preparing a dramatic entrance. She remembered what Mr. Weasley had said back at the campsite before the Quidditch World Cup. "Always the same, we can't resist showing off when we get together." And then Dumbledore called out from the back row, where he stood with the other teachers. "Aha! Unless I am very much mistaken, the delegation from Beauxbatons approaches." "Where?" said many students eagerly, all looking in different directions. "There!" yelled a sixth year, pointing over the forest. Something large, much larger than a broomstick, or indeed 100 broomsticks, was hurtling across the deep blue sky toward the castle, growing larger all the time. "It's a dragon!" shrieked one of the first years, losing her head completely. "Don't be stupid." "It's a flying house," said another first-year boy. The boy's guess was closer. As the gigantic black shape skimmed over the treetops of the forbidden forest, and the lights shining from the castle hit it, they saw a gigantic, powder-blue, horse-drawn carriage, the size of a large house, soaring toward them, pulled through the air by a dozen winged horses, all palominos, and each the size of an elephant. The front 3 rows of students drew backward as the carriage hurtled ever lower, coming in to land at a tremendous speed then, with an almighty crash. The horses' hooves, larger than dinner plates, they hit the ground. A second later, the carriage landed too, bouncing upon its vast wheels, while the golden horses Abraxans, Violet knew from her various books on magical creatures, tossed their enormous heads and rolled large, fiery red eyes. Violet just had time to see that the door of the carriage bore a coat of arms, 2 crossed, golden wands, each emitting 3 stars, before it opened. A boy in pale blue robes jumped down from the carriage, fumbled for a moment with something on the carriage, and unfolded a set of golden steps. He sprang back respectfully. Then Violet saw a shining, high-heeled black shoe emerging from the inside of the carriage. A shoe the size of a child's sled followed, almost immediately, by the largest woman she had ever seen in her life. The size of the carriage and of the horses was immediately explained. A few people, including Violet, gasped. Violet had only ever seen one person as large as this woman in her life, and that was Hagrid. She doubted whether there was indifference in their heights. Yet somehow, maybe simply because she was so used to Hagrid, this woman, now at the foot of the steps, and looking around at the waiting, wide-eyed crowd, seemed even more unnaturally large. As she stepped into the light flooding from the entrance hall, she was revealed to have a handsome, olive-skinned face, large, black, liquid-looking eyes, and a strong, arched nose. Her hair was drawn back in a shining bun at the base of her neck. She was dressed from head to foot in black satin, and many magnificent opals gleamed at her throat and on her fingers. Dumbledore started to clap. The students, following his lead, broke into applause too, many of them standing on tiptoe, the better to look at this magnificent woman. Her face relaxed into a gracious smile, and she walked forward toward Professor Dumbledore, extending a glittering hand. Dumbledore, though tall himself, had barely to bend to kiss it. "My dear Madame Maxime," he said. "Welcome to Hogwarts." Dumbledore, said Madame Maxine in a deep, throaty sort of voice that made Violet feel slightly melty. I hope I find you well. In excellent form, I thank you, said Dumbledore. My pupils, said Madame Maxim, waving one her enormous hands carelessly behind her. Violet, whose attention had been focused completely upon the beautiful Madame Maxim, now noticed that about a dozen boys and girls, all, by the look of them, in their late teens, had emerged from the carriage and were now standing behind Madame Maxim. They were shivering, which was unsurprising, given that their robes seemed to be made of fine silk, and none of them were wearing cloaks. A few had colorful scarves wrapped around their heads. From what Violet could see of them, they were standing in Madame Maxim's long shadow. They were staring up at Hogwarts with apprehensive looks on their faces. Has Karkaroff arrived yet? Madame Maxim asked. There was a funny, strangled sort of noise from Violet's left. It sounded like someone had just had all the air squeezed abruptly from them. She looked curiously down the line and was surprised to see Cassius. Face had turned a horrible, blotchy red, his blue eyes wide as he stared at Dumbledore and Madame Maxim. Violet opened her mouth to whisper to him when Professor Dumbledore spoke. He should be here any moment, he said. Would you like to wait here and greet him, or would you prefer to step inside and warm up a trifle? Warm up, I think, said Madame Maxim. But horses, our care of magical creatures teacher, will be delighted to take care of them, said Dumbledore, the moment he has returned from dealing with a slight situation that has arisen with some of his other charges. Scroots, Tracy muttered to Violet, oblivious to Cass's strange reaction. My steeds require forceful handling, said Madame Maxim, looking as though she doubted whether any care of magical creatures teacher at Hogwarts would be up to the job. They are very strong. I assure you that Hagrid will be well up to the job, said Dumbledore, smiling. Very well, said Madame Maxim, bowing slightly. Will you please inform Hagrid that horses only drink single malt whiskey? It will be attended to, said Dumbledore, also bowing. Come, said Madame Maxim imperiously to her students, and the Hogwarts crowd parted to allow her and her students to pass up the stone steps. Violet stood on tiptoes to watch her go, mouth hanging slightly open. Then, when the Beauxbaton students were out of sight, she turned back to Cassius. What's the matter? She whispered, leaning around Millicent Bulstrode to do so. Are you all right? Fine, said Cass from between his clenched teeth. He was staring straight ahead now and wouldn't look at Violet. You're clearly not, Violet pushed. I said I'm fine, Cass snapped, suddenly sharp. A few other people, including Tracy, looked round at him. Violet flinched and straightened back into line. What's wrong with him? Tracy asked, looking between them with wide eyes. Nothing, apparently, Violet said tightly. She didn't like being snapped at that way, but this wasn't the place to have that conversation. She stood, shivering slightly now, and joined in waiting for the Durmstrang party to arrive. Most people were gazing hopefully up at the sky. For a few minutes, the silence was broken only by Madame Maxim's huge horses snorting and stamping. But then, can you hear something? Said Tracy suddenly. Violet listened. A loud and oddly eerie noise was drifting toward them from out of the darkness, a muffled rumbling and sucking sound, as though an immense vacuum cleaner were moving along a riverbed. The lake, yelled Lee Jordan, pointing down to it. Look at the lake. From their position at the top of the lawns overlooking the grounds, they had a clear view of the smooth black surface of the water, except that the surface was suddenly not smooth at all. Some disturbance was taking place deep in the center. Great bubbles were forming on the surface. Waves were now washing over the muddy banks, and then, out in the very middle of the lake, a whirlpool appeared, as if a giant plug had just been pulled out of the lake's floor. What seemed to be a long, black pole began to rise slowly out of the heart of the whirlpool, and then Violet saw the rigging. It's a mast, she gasped to Tracy. Slowly, magnificently, the ship rose out of the water, gleaming in the moonlight. It had a strangely skeletal look about it, as though it were a resurrected wreck, and the dim, misty lights shimmering at its portholes looked like ghostly eyes. Finally, with a great sloshing noise, the ship emerged entirely, bobbing on the turbulent water, and began to glide toward the bank. A few moments later, they heard the splash of an anchor being thrown down in the shallows, and the thud of a plank being lowered onto the bank. People were disembarking. They could see their silhouettes passing the lights in the ship's portholes. All of them, Violet noticed, seemed to be built along the lines of Crab and Goyle. But then, as they drew nearer, walking up the lawns into the light streaming from the entrance hall, she saw that their bulk was really due to the fact that they were wearing cloaks of some kind of shaggy, matted fur. But the man who was leading them up to the castle was wearing furs of a different sort, sleek and silver like his hair. "Dumbledore," he called heartily, in a fruity, unctuous sort of voice as he walked up the slope. "How are you, my dear fellow, how are you?" "Blooming, thank you, Professor Karkaroff," Dumbledore replied. Violet immediately looked down the line at Cass. Cass looked, remarkably so, like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming freight train. Violet could see the entire whites of his eyes, and there was something horrible about the twist of his mouth. His hands, clenched into white-knuckled fists at his sides, were visibly trembling. Violet quickly looked back to the man who had just arrived, who was now shaking Dumbledore's hand with both of his own. In the light pouring from the front doors of the castle, they saw that he was tall and thin like Dumbledore, but his white hair was short, and his goatee, finishing in a small curl, did not entirely hide his rather weak chin. "Dear old Hogwarts," he said, looking up at the castle and smiling. His teeth were rather yellow, and Violet noticed that his smile did not extend to his eyes, which remained cold and shrewd. "How good it is to be here, how good. Victor, come along into the warmth. You don't mind, Dumbledore? Victor has a slight head cold." Karkaroff beckoned forward one of his students. As the boy passed, Violet caught a glimpse of a prominent curved nose and thick black eyebrows. She gasped aloud as the recognition hit her. It was a familiar profile, one she had seen streaking through the air at high speeds only a month before. Victor Crumb. Chapter 12. The Goblet of Fire. "I can't believe it," Violet said, still stunned, as the Hogwarts students filed back up the steps behind the party from Durmstrang. "It really is Crumb." "Who's Crumb?" Tracy asked, eyeing the Durmstrang students excitedly. "Is he famous?" "He's a Quidditch player. We saw him play for Bulgaria at the World Cup," Violet said. "I had no idea he was still at school." As they recrossed the entrance hall with the rest of the Hogwarts students, heading for the Great Hall, Violet saw Lee Jordan jumping up and down on the soles of his feet to get a better look at the back of Crumb's head. Several sixth-year girls were frantically searching their pockets as they walked. "Oh, I don't believe it. I haven't got a single quill on me. Do you think he'd sign my hat in lipstick?" "Should I get his autograph?" Tracy asked furtively, clinging to Violet's sleeve. "You've met him, could you get me his autograph?" "I didn't meet him," muttered Violet. "And what do you want his autograph for? You didn't even know who he was a minute ago." They walked over to Slytherin table and sat down. Instead of sitting with Tracy and Violet as he usually did, Cassius sat down the table with his fellow sixth years. Tracy was too busy positioning herself to view Crumb and his fellow Durmstrang students to notice the terrible look still on Cass's face. "They're coming over here," squeaked Tracy, elbowing Violet hard in the ribs. "Budge up, look, he's headed this way." The Durmstrang students were indeed coming toward the Slytherin table, and a great amount of shuffling took place to make room for the boys and girls in their bulky furs. Victor Crumb did sit quite close to Violet and Tracy, unfortunately. His attention was immediately snatched by Draco Malfoy, who leaned in to introduce himself before Crumb had even finished sitting down. The Durmstrang students began pulling off their heavy furs, revealing robes of a deep blood red, and looking up at the starry black ceiling with expressions of interest. A couple of them were picking up the golden plates and goblets, apparently impressed. By contrast, the Beauxbaton students, who had seated themselves at the Ravenclaw table, were looking around the great hall with glum expressions on their faces. At least they had stopped shivering. Up at the staff table, Filch, the caretaker, was adding chairs. He was wearing his mouldy old tailcoat in honor of the occasion. Violet was surprised to see that he added 4 chairs, 2 on either side of Professor Dumbledore's. "But there's only 2 extra people," Violet said. "Who are the other chairs meant for?" Said Tracy vaguely. She was still peeking avidly at Crumb. When all the students had entered the hall and settled down at their house tables, the staff entered, filing up to the top table and taking their seats. Last in line were Professor Dumbledore, Professor Karkaroff, and Madame Maxim. When their headmistress appeared, the pupils from Beauxbatons leapt to their feet. A few of the Hogwarts students laughed. The Beauxbatons party appeared quite unembarrassed, however, and did not resume their seats until Madame Maxim had sat down on Dumbledore's left-hand side. Professor Dumbledore remained standing, and a silence fell over the great hall. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, ghosts and most particularly guests," said Dumbledore, beaming around at the foreign students. "I have great pleasure in welcoming you all to Hogwarts. I hope and trust that your stay here will be both comfortable and enjoyable." One of the Beauxbatons girls, wearing a colorful headscarf, gave what was unmistakably a derisive laugh. "The tournament will be officially opened at the end of the feast," said Dumbledore, paying no mind. "I now invite you all to eat, drink, and make yourselves at home." He sat down, and Violet saw Karkaroff lean forward at once and engage him in conversation. The plates in front of them filled with food as usual. There was a greater variety of dishes in front of them than Violet had ever seen, including several that were definitely foreign. "I bet the house elves worked overtime to get all of this ready," Violet said to Tracy, hesitantly helping herself to a dish of some sort of shellfish stew. Tracy's expression of delight dropped. "I hadn't thought of that. Oh no. Violet, should we be eating any of this?" Violet shrugged unhappily and said, "Better than letting it go to waste. Look, there's black pudding and all." "Oh, delightful," said Tracy, not looking delighted at all. I think I'll just have some of that bouillabaisse too." "Bouilla what?" Tracy laughed. "Bouillabaisse," she repeated. "The soup you just got with the shellfish in it." Violet, who had her spoon nearly to her mouth, dropped it immediately. "Shellfish," she cried, staring into her bowl in horror. Now that she was actually looking, she could plainly see the white edges of the clam shells peeking out from beneath the thick broth and chunks of tomato. She hastily shoved the bowl in Tracy's direction. "Take it, I can't eat this." "What, don't you like seafood?" "Dunno, I can't eat it," Violet told her, shaking her head. "I get all itchy, and it makes my throat swell up. The only time my aunt and uncle ever took me to hospital was after I ate a prawn and puffed up like a marshmallow." Tracy covered her mouth in horror. "Violet, that's awful. Why didn't you tell me before now?" "I didn't think it would come up. I just steer clear of it on my own, but I didn't expect it to be in the soup." "What about Harry?" Tracy said, quickly turning around to look at the Gryffindor table. "Should you warn him about the soup so he doesn't eat it too?" "Nah, he's not bothered by it," Violet said. "Harry can eat the prawns he wants, the prat." Tracy laughed loud enough that a few people, including Victor Crumb, glanced down the table at her. Hagrid sidled into the hall through a door behind the staff table 20 minutes after the start of the feast. He slid into his seat at the end and waved back at those looking after him with a very heavily bandaged hand. "Oh, I hope the Scroots didn't do that to him," Tracy said nervously. "We've got to look after them on Monday." Violet grimaced, but any thoughts of Hagrid's horrid Scroots was quickly wiped from her mind. The door behind the staff table had opened again, and 2 more familiar faces had just stepped through and filled the 2 remaining empty seats. Ludo Bagman was now sitting on Professor Karkaroff's other side, while Mr. Crouch, Percy's boss, was next to Madame Maxim. "Who are they?" Tracy asked, following Violet's stunned eyeline. "Do you know them as well?" "Sort of," said Violet, staring. She wasn't pleased to see Mr. Crouch again. "We were introduced at the World Cup. They helped organize the Triwizard tournament. I suppose they'd want to be here to see it start." When the second course arrived, they noticed a number of unfamiliar desserts too. An assortment of golden, flaky pastries appeared near Crumb, and he sampled generously from them. All of the Durmstrang students seemed to be enjoying the meal immensely. Down the table, Violet noted with concern that Cass had barely added anything to his plate. Once the golden plates had been wiped clean, Professor Dumbledore stood up again. A pleasant sort of tension seemed to fill the hall now. Violet felt a slight thrill of excitement, wondering what was coming. "The moment has come," said Dumbledore, smiling around at the sea of upturned faces. "The Triwizard Tournament is about to start. I would like to say a few words of explanation before we bring in the casket." "Thew hat," Violet muttered. Tracy shrugged. "Just to clarify the procedure that we will be following this year. But first, let me introduce, for those who do not know them, Mr. Bartemius Crouch, head of the Department of International Magical Cooperation." There was a smattering of polite applause, to which Violet did not contribute, and Mr. Ludo Bagman, head of the Department of Magical Games and Sport. There was a much louder round of applause for Bagman than for Crouch, perhaps of his fame as a beater, or simply because he looked so much more likable. He acknowledged it with a jovial wave of his hand. Bartemius Crouch did not smile or wave when his name was announced. Remembering him in his neat suit at the Quidditch World Cup, Violet thought he looked strange in wizard's robes. His toothbrush mustache and severe parting looked very odd next to Dumbledore's long white hair and beard. "Mr. Bagman and Mr. Crouch have worked tirelessly over the last few months on the arrangements for the Triwizard Tournament," Dumbledore continued, "and they will be joining myself, Professor Karkaroff, and Madame Maxime on the panel that will judge the champions' efforts." At the mention of the word champions, the attentiveness of the listening students seemed to sharpen. Perhaps Dumbledore had noticed their sudden stillness, for he smiled as he said, "The casket, then, if you please, Mr. Filch." Filch, who had been lurking unnoticed in a far corner of the hall, now approached Dumbledore carrying a great wooden chest encrusted with jewels. It looked extremely old. A murmur of excited interest rose from the watching students. A few people actually stood up to see it properly. The instructions for the tasks the champions will face this year have already been examined by Mr. Crouch and Mr. Bagman, said Professor Dumbledore as Filch placed the chest carefully on the table before him, "and they have made the necessary arrangements for each challenge. There will be 3 tasks, spaced throughout the school year, and they will test the champions in many different ways. Their magical prowess, their daring, their powers of deduction, and of course, their ability to cope with danger." At this last word, the hall was filled with a silence so absolute that nobody seemed to be breathing. "As you know, 3 champions compete in the tournament," Dumbledore went on calmly, "one from each of the participating schools. They will be marked on how well they perform each of the tournament tasks, and the champion with the highest total after Task 3 will win the Triwizard Cup. The champions will be chosen by an impartial selector, the Goblet of Fire." Dumbledore now took out his wand and tapped 3 times upon the top of casket. The lid creaked slowly open. Dumbledore reached inside it and pulled out a large, roughly hewn wooden cup. It would have been entirely unremarkable had it not been full to the brim with dancing blue-white flames. Dumbledore closed the casket and placed the goblet carefully on top of it, where it would be clearly visible to everyone in the hall. Anybody wishing to submit themselves as a champion must write their name and school clearly upon a slip of parchment and drop it into the goblet, said Professor Dumbledore. Aspiring champions have 24 hours in which to put their names forward. Tomorrow night, Halloween, the goblet will return the names of the 3 it has judged most worthy to represent their schools. The goblet will be placed in the entrance hall tonight, where it will be freely accessible to all those wishing to compete. To ensure that no underage student yields to temptation, said Dumbledore, I will be drawing an age line around the Goblet of Fire once it has been placed in the entrance hall. Nobody under the age of 17 will be able to cross this line. Finally, I wish to impress upon any of you wishing to compete that this tournament is not be entered lightly. Once a champion has been selected by the Goblet of Fire, they are obliged to see the tournament through to the end. The placing of your name into the goblet constitutes a binding, magical contract. There can be no change of heart once you have become a champion. Please be very sure, therefore, that you are wholeheartedly prepared to play before you drop your name into the goblet. Now, I think it is time for bed. Good night to you all. What's an age line? Violet asked Tracy as they all began rising from the table. Tracy shrugged. I don't know, she said. But if it's going to be in the middle of the entrance hall, how are people supposed to get to their classes without crossing it? Will we get in trouble if we touch it? Maybe it's just like a barrier, Violet said. I don't suppose it would Bethet in the way. Violet and Tracy had just joined the back of the crowd, funneling through the doorway when she bumped into Harry, Ron, and Hermione. Did you see him? Ron said at once, staring intently over Violet's shoulder. Did you talk to him? What did he say? Did he remember us? Who? Violet asked, bewildered. Ron nodded jerkily behind her. Crumb, he said. Are they gonna be staying with you? Dumbledore didn't say where the Durmstrang people are sleeping, did he? But this query was answered almost instantly. Violet turned and saw that Karkaroff had just bustled up to his students. Back to the ship, then, he was saying. Victor, how are you feeling? Did you eat enough? Should I send for some mulled wine from the kitchens? Violet saw Crumb shake his head, and he pulled his furs back on. He didn't look particularly enthused to have Karkaroff doting on him, she noticed. Professor, I would like some wine, said one of the other Durmstrang boys hopefully. I wasn't offering it to you, Poliakov, his warmly paternal air vanishing in an instant. I notice you have dribbled food all down the front of your robes again. Disgusting boy. Karkaroff turned and led his students toward the doors, reaching them at exactly the same moment as Harry, Violet, and their friends. Harry stopped in place to let him walk through first. Thank you, said Karkaroff carelessly, glancing at him, and then Karkaroff froze. He turned his head back to Harry, gaze flickering quickly between him and Violet, standing just behind him, and stared as though he couldn't believe his eyes. Behind their headmaster, the students from Durmstrang came to a halt too. Karkaroff's eyes moved slowly up Harry's face and fixed upon his scar. The Durmstrang students were staring curiously at them too. Out of the corner of her eye, Violet sat comprehension dawn on a few of their faces. The boy will food all down his front, nudged the girl next to him, and pointed openly at Harry's forehead. Yeah, that's the Potters, said a growling voice from behind them. Professor Karkaroff spun around. Mad-Eye Moody was standing there, leaning heavily on his staff, his magical eye glaring unblinkingly at the Durmstrang headmaster. The color drained from Karkaroff's face as Violet watched. A terrible look of mingled fury and fear came over him. You, he said, staring at Moody as though unsure he was really seeing him. Me, said Moody grimly. And unless you've got anything to say to the twins, Karkaroff, you might want to move. You're blocking the doorway. It was true. Half the students in the hall were now waiting behind them, looking over one another's shoulders to see what was causing the hold-up. Without another word, Professor Karkaroff swept his students away with him. Moody watched him until he was out of sight, his magical eye fixed upon his back, a look of intense dislike upon his mutilated face. As the next day was Saturday, most students would normally breakfast late, so Violet and Tracy didn't find it strange for Cassius not to be up and about in the common room when they awoke. They were not alone in rising much earlier than they usually did on weekends. When they went down into the entrance hall, they saw about 20 people milling around it, some of them eating toast, all examining the goblet of fire. It had been placed in the center of the hall on the stool that normally bore the sorting hat. A thin golden line had been traced on the floor, forming a circle 10 feet around it in all directions. Unsurprisingly, Harry, Ron, and Hermione were already loitering around it. Who all has put their names in? Tracy asked excitedly as she and Violet hurried over. Dunno, Ron said. We just got here too. Oi, he flagged down a third-year girl. Anyone put their name in yet? All the Durmstrang lot, she replied. But I haven't seen anyone from Hogwarts yet. Bet some of them put it in last night after we'd all gone to bed, said Harry. I would have if it had been me. Wouldn't have wanted everyone watching. What if the goblet just garbed you right back out again? Violet squinted suspiciously at her brother. Harry, you haven't put your name in, have you? Of course not, said Harry, frowning. We're a long way from 17, Romans 6. Besides, I think I'd like to have a quiet year for once, you know. Someone laughed behind Harry. Turning, they saw Fred, George, and Lee Jordan hurrying down the staircase, all three of them looking extremely excited. Done it, Fred said in a triumphant whisper to the five of them. Just taken it. What? Said Violet. The aging potion, said Fred, his eyes sparkling, to get past the age line. 1 drop each, said George, rubbing his hands together with glee. We only need to be a few months older. We're going to split the 1,000 galleons between the three of us if one of us wins, said Lee, grinning broadly. I'm not sure this is going to work, you know, said Hermione warningly. I'm sure Dumbledore will have thought of this. I believe in you, Violet said boldly. Fred, George, and Lee beamed at her. Ready? Said Fred to the other two, quivering with excitement. Come on, then I'll go first. Violet watched, apprehensive despite her words of encouragement, as Fred pulled a slip of parchment out of his pocket, bearing the Wordsford Weasley Hogwarts. Fred walked right up to the edge of the line and stood there, rocking on his toes like a diver preparing for a 50-foot drop. Then, with the eyes of every person in the entrance hall upon him, he took a great breath and stepped over the line. For a split second, Violet thought it had worked. George certainly thought so, for he let out a yell of triumph and leapt after Fred, but next moment there was a loud sizzling sound, and both twins were hurled out of the golden circle as though they had been thrown by an invisible sharp putter. They landed painfully, 10 feet away on the cold stone floor, and both of them sprouted identical long white beards. The entrance hall rang with laughter. Even Fred and George joined in, once they had gotten to their feet and taken a good look at each other's beards. I did warn you, said a deep, amused voice, and everyone turned to see Professor Dumbledore coming out of the great hall. He surveyed Fred and George, his eyes twinkling. I suggest you both go up to Madame Pomfrey. She is already tending to Miss Fawcett of Ravenclaw and Mr. Summers of Hufflepuff, both of whom decided to age themselves up a little too. Though I must say, neither of their beards is anything like as fine as yours. Fred and George set off for the hospital wing, accompanied by Lee, who was howling with laughter, and Harry and Violet parted ways, also chortling, as they went in to breakfast. The decorations in the great hall had changed this morning. As it was Halloween, a cloud of live bats was fluttering around the enchanted ceiling, while hundreds of carved pumpkins leered from every corner. Violet and Tracy headed over to Slytherin Table, where Susanna and Millicent were discussing those Hogwarts students of 17 or over who might be entering. Derek and Bowl are planning to put their names in at lunchtime, said Susanna, rumpling her nose. I overheard them talking about it last night. They think that's when they'll have the biggest audience. I hope neither of them gets picked, Millicent muttered. Not that I don't want one of ours for to be champion, mind, she added quickly, just not of those idiots. What about Warrington? Asked Susanna eagerly. He had a birthday last week. You two spend a lot of time with him. Has he said anything about entering the competition? Not twos, said Tracy, but apparently he's mentioned it. Violet started to ask, have you heard about anyone from other houses trying out? But was drowned out by a sudden cheering from the entrance hall. They all swiveled around in their seats and saw Angelina Johnson coming into the hall, grinning in an embarrassed sort of way. A tall black girl, Violet recognized her as being one of the chasers on the Gryffindor Quidditch team. Susanna was shaking her head in disgust. We can't have a Gryffindor champion. It's bad enough, them stealing the house cup from under us the last few years. And all the Hufflepuffs are talking about Diggory, said Millicent, scowling. Thought I can't imagine who I wouldn't have thought he'd want to risk his good looks. He's really clever, though, said Tracy at once, and the other three girls looked at her. She cleared her throat and said, I mean, he studies a lot, and he is a prefect after all. He'd be better than Derek or Bowl. Maybe so, but he's still a Hufflepuff, Susanna said, as though that settled the matter. Looking very much like she wanted to say something else, Tracy shut her mouth and turned away to enjoy her oatmeal. When breakfast was nearly over and there had still been no sign of Cass, Violet began to worry. Breakfast was his favorite meal of the day, and it wasn't like him not to seek her and Tracy out to say good morning. But then, it was unlike him to stomp off to bed without a backward glance as he had done the night before. Something was up, Violet concluded. He'd been acting strange all year, first around Professor Moody, and the night before when Professor Karkaroff arrived. There was a connection there that Cass wasn't telling them about, and as much as Violet understood and respected keeping some things to oneself, she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever this was something that needed airing out. Agreeing to meet back in the entrance hall in an hour, Violet and Tracy set out in opposite directions in search of Cass. What Violet didn't tell Tracy, and felt only slightly guilty about doing, was that she planned to use the Marauder's map to find where Cass had slipped off to. The map, created by her father and his friends while they were at school, portrayed a detailed layout of Hogwarts castle and grounds. As large and confusing as the school was, this would have been a feat in and of itself, but the Marauders, as they called themselves, took it several steps farther. Moving across the map's surface were hundreds upon hundreds little black dots, all accompanied by a tiny little name tag, one for every single person in the school. There, down by the edge of the forbidden forest, was Hagrid outside of his hut, likely tending to his garden. Peeves the poltergeist was up to some sort of mischief in the astronomy tower. Down in the dungeons, where Violet looked first to be sure that Cass wasn't simply having a lie-in, she saw the Slytherin common room was packed with the Quidditch team. Cass's name was nowhere to be found, however. It took 10 minutes of careful searching, squinting down at the little ant-like dots scurrying back and forth, before Violet finally located the one bearing the name Cassius Warrington. He was all alone, pacing around the third-floor trophy room. Violet watched his dart for a moment, making sure he wasn't about to leave and head somewhere else, before wiping the map, stuffing it inside the pocket of her robes, and setting off. The trophy room was one of the many parts of the castle that Violet had never been to before. It didn't seem to be a very popular place, though perhaps everyone was currently distracted by the goblet of fire in the entrance hall. She only passed one other person on the way upstairs, and then the halls were quiet and empty. The door of the trophy room was less a door, really, than a large iron gate. It opened smoothly and silently as Violet pressed a hand against the bars and slipped inside. The large room was covered floor to ceiling in shelves containing all manner of trophies, awards, cups, plates, shields, and medals, all gleaming as though freshly polished from behind their crystal cases. Several grand bronze statues stood in the center of the room. A life-sized figure with flowing hair and robes held aloft what looked like a round, fat little bird. Another portrayed a meek-looking man, head bowed over the sculpted sword in his outstretched hands. The contents of the room were so dazzling that for a moment Violet forgot what she'd come here for, and then Cassius stepped out from behind one of the statues, arms crossed and frowning, and she remembered. "Oh," Violet said. "Hi. Should have known you'd find me," Cass grunted. He didn't look pleased to see her. "Is Tracy here too?" "No," said Violet. "Just me." Mirroring his posture, though mostly to stop herself from fidgeting, she crossed her arms as well and said, "We missed you at breakfast." "I wasn't hungry." "Oh," said Violet again. Are you feeling all right?" "Fine, thanks," said Cass in the same flat, dismissive voice. "Just wanted some time to myself." "Oh," Violet repeated, feeling more stupid by the moment. Of course he'd wanted to be alone. That's why he wasn't with her and Tracy in the first place. If he'd Wintetto talk to them, then he would have, instead of hiding away in the most unlikely of places all by himself. "Did you want something?" Cass asked abruptly, and Violet felt her face go red. "I'm just worried about you," she blurted defensively. "Me and Tracy, we both are. You've been acting funny, and you won't tell us anything." I just thought if there was something going on that you might want to talk about it. Cassius gave her a long, impassive stare. There was a muscle going in his jaw, like he was angry, only his eyes didn't have any anger in them at all. Then, just when Violet was ready to turn tail and leave him be, he said, "There's nothing to be worried about, Romans 6. Thanks for checking up on me, but you can tell Tracy I'm all right. I really just want to be alone for a little while." The finality in his tone was undeniable. Violet had been well and truly shut out. But if there was one trait that Violet had in common with her brother, despite their many differences, as people had become so fond of pointing out to them, it was stubbornness. Does this have anything to do with that man from Durmstrang? Professor Karkaroff. At the name, Cass's eyes widened. There was a flash of anger and maybe panic, and this his face smoothed over into deliberate blankness. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said flatly. "I saw your face when his name came up, and when he was shaking Dumbledore's hand," Violet pressed, standing her ground. "And you hardly ate anything at dinner. Who is he to you?" "Nobody," Cass said. "He's not anybody to me. He's obviously Somion." "I didn't see anyone else reacting the way you did." The tick in his cheek jumped visibly. "So you had a look around at everyone then, did you? Glad to know I'm not the only one under constant nanny watch." Violet frowned, hurt. "That's not fair, Cassius. And you're changing the subject. Notice that too, eh? I'm only trying to help you. Why are you being such an arse about it? I didn't ask for your help, and I've already told you about a dozen times that nothing's wrong. I'm trying to have some time to myself. Is that a bloody crime now? But what about Karkaroff? It doesn't matter, Violet," shouted Cass, unable to keep his cool any longer. "It doesn't matter who he is, or what he's done, or whether or not I've got a problem with him. It's got nothing to do with you. It's none of your business, all right?" Violet took a step backwards, startled by his tone and his words. Both of his hands were balled into fists at his sides, and the blotchiness was back in his cheeks. She'd never seen him this angry before, not at anyone. The fact that it was Athrunley made it worse. Violet swallowed. "Okay," she said, trying not to sound as scared as she felt. "Fine. Sorry then, for bothering you about it." Violet turned on her heel and walked briskly back the way she'd come, past the trophies and out through the gleaming metal doors. Her footsteps echoed evenly off the stone walls as she hurried along, fighting back the usual tears that allows followed any sort of confrontation. She swallowed back her hurt and confusion and forced it down into a neat, manageable little ball that sat like a stone in her belly. Sitting on the steps in the entrance hall, it took 20 minutes for Tracy to make her way back, panting, with a slight sheen of sweat on her forehead. "I've looked everywhere," she panted. "I thought I'd found him in the astronomy tower, but it was only Peeves putting soot on all the telescopes. Professor Sinistra will be furious when she finds out. What about you? Any luck?" "No," Violet lied, not really sure why she was doing so. I didn't find him either." Tracy chewed her lower lip, looking very concerned. "You don't think something's happened to him, do you? Should we go and check in the hospital wing?" "He's probably fine," said Violet quickly. "I mean, we'd have heard if he was hurt or anything. Maybe he just needed a break." "A break from what?" "Us," Violet said, shrugging. Tracy balked. "That's ridiculous. We're wonderful. I'll bet he's trying to rile us up and try to make us feel stupid for supporting SPEW. Well, that's not going to work. I'd never turn my back on a good cause." She puffed out her chest slightly, showing off the bright blue button pinned to her robes. Violet fished her own badge out of her pocket and hastily pinned it on as well. She smiled weakly at Tracy. "I'm sure he'll turn up, Trace," she said, her stomach lurching uneasily. But the smile stayed on and seemed to put Tracy at ease. There was no sign of Cass for the rest of the day, even though both Tracy and Violet were keeping a keen eye out for him. By 5:30, it was growing dark, and the school was beginning to buzz with the excitement of the Halloween feast, and more important, the announcement of the school champions. When they entered the candlelit great hall, it was almost full. The goblet of fire had been moved. It was now standing in front of Dumbledore's empty chair at the teacher's table. And there, Sitting in his usual seat with his hands resting casually on the table was Cass. Tracy descended upon him at once. "Where have you been?" she hissed, startling the two fifth-year boys to his right. "Do you know we've been looking everywhere for you?" "I've been around," Cassius said, smiling calmly at her. His eyes passed smoothly over Violet, cool and dispassionate. This only seemed to infuriate Tracy even more. "Around? What does that even mean?" "It means I was around, and now I'm here," he said plainly, still maintaining his calm tone and expression, despite the fact that a vein was pulsing in Tracy's forehead. "Can't wait for some yummy treacle, can you?" "You're a menace," Tracy muttered, as the golden plates in front of them filled with all manner of delicious, steaming foods. "We were really worried about you, you know. And while you were busy avoiding us, you've missed your chance to put your name in for the tournament." "I have not," said Cass. "I put my name in the goblet hours ago." "What?" said Violet and Tracy together, stunned. "How could you have?" Tracy cried. "We've been waiting around in the entrance hall for most of the day, and didn't see you." "I did it this morning," Cass told them, spearing a thick slice of ham from a heaping platter, "before anyone else was up." "Nobody else saw me either. But where's the fun in that?" demanded Tracy. "And why didn't you tell us you planned to do it in the first place?" "Because I'm a menace, I suppose," he answered, smirking. Cass's dramatic mood shift had Violet watching him out of the corner of her eye, on edge and uncertain. Hesimidkama, but how much of it was an act? While she too had a knack for concealing her true feelings from her friends, Violet realized that she didn't have a great deal of practice knowing when anyone besides Harry was doing it to her. The Halloween feast seemed to take much longer than usual. Perhaps because it was their second feast in 2 days, Violet didn't seem to fancy the extravagantly prepared food as much as she would have normally. Like everyone else in the hall, judging by the constantly craning necks, the impatient expressions on every face, the fidgeting, and the standing up to see whether Dumbledore had finished eating yet, Violet simply wanted the plates to clear and to hear who had been selected as champions. At long last, the golden plates returned to their original spotless state. There was a sharp upswing in the level of noise within the hall, which died away almost instantly as Professor Dumbledore got to his feet. On either side of him, Professor Karkaroff and Madame Maxime looked as tense and expectant as anyone. Ludo Bagman was beaming and winking at various students. Mr. Crouch, however, looked quite uninterested, almost bored. "Well, the goblet is almost ready to make its decision," said Dumbledore. "I estimate that it requires 1 more minute. Now, when the champions' names are called, I would ask them please to come up to the top of the hall, walk along the staff table, and go through into the next chamber." He indicated the door behind the staff table, where they will be receiving their first instructions. He took out his wand and gave a great sweeping wave with it. At once, all the candles except those inside the carved pumpkins were extinguished, plunging them into a state of semi-darkness. The goblet of fire now shone more brightly than anything in the whole hall, the sparkling bright, blue-eye whiteness of the flames almost painful on the eyes. Everyone watched, waiting. A few people kept checking their watches. "Any second," Susanna Runcorn whispered, 2 seats away from Violet. The flames inside the goblet turned suddenly red. Sparks began to fly from it. Next moment, a tongue of flame shot into the air. A charred piece of parchment fluttered out of it. The whole room gasped. Dumbledore caught the piece of parchment and held it at arm's length so that he could read it by the light of the flames, which had returned to blue-white. "The champion for Durmstrang," he read, in a strong, clear voice, "will be Victor Crumb." A storm of applause and cheering swept the hall. Violet watched Victor Crumb rise from his seat down the table from her and slouch up toward Dumbledore. He turned right, walked along the staff table, and disappeared through the door into the next chamber. "Bravo, Victor," boomed Karkaroff, so loudly that everyone could hear him, even over all the applause. "Knew you had it in you." The clapping and chatting died down. Now everyone's attention was focused again on the goblet, which, seconds later, turned red once more. A second piece of parchment shot out of it, propelled by the flames. "The champion for Beauxbatons," said Dumbledore, "is Fleur de Lacre." From the Ravenclaw table rose the most beautiful girl that Violet had ever seen in her life. She watched slack-jawed as Fleur de Lacre got gracefully to her feet, shook back a sheet of silvery blonde hair, and swept up between the Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff tables. "Oh, look, they're all disappointed," said Tracy over the noise, nodding toward the remainder of the Beauxbatons party. Disappointed was a bit of an understatement, Violet thought, tearing her eyes away from the beautiful girl. Two of the girls who had not been selected had dissolved into tears and were sobbing with their heads on their arms. When Fleur de Lacre, too, had vanished into the side chamber, silence fell again, but this time it was a silence so stiff with excitement you could almost taste it. The Hogwarts champion next. And the goblet of fire turned red once more. Sparks showered out of it. The tongue of flame shot high into the air, and from its tip Dumbledore pulled the third piece of parchment. "The Hogwarts champion," he called, "is Cassius Warrington." "What?" said Cassius loudly, but nobody heard him except Violet. The uproar was too great. Every single Slytherin had jumped to their feet, screaming and stamping, pulling at Cass as he stood there, wide-eyed and dumbstruck. "You prat!" Tracy was screaming, jumping up and down as she shoved Cass forward, at once furious and delighted. "You did it! I can't believe you did it!" Violet was clapping so hard that her hands hurt as Cass finally made his way down the hall, looking dazed, and headed off toward the chamber behind the teacher's table. But while the Slytherins were all hollering in celebration, the reception from the rest of the school was decided chilly. The Ravenclaw were cheering, and the Hufflepuffs looked to be on their feet out of pure excitement, but the Gryffindor table was rather muted by comparison. Nonetheless, the Slytherins were making enough noise for all of them. Indeed, the applause for Cass went on so long that it was some time before Dumbledore could make himself heard again. "Excellent," Dumbledore called happily as at last the tumult died down. "Well, we now have our three champions. I am sure I can count upon all of you, including the remaining students from Beauxbatons and Durmstrang, to give your champions every ounce of support you can muster. By cheering your champion on, you will contribute in a very real," but Dumbledore suddenly stopped speaking, and it was apparent to everybody what had distracted him. The fire in the goblet had just turned red again. Sparks were flying out of it. A long flame shot suddenly into the air, and borne upon it was another piece of parchment. Automatically, it seemed. Dumbledore reached out a long hand and seized the parchment. He held it out and stared at the name written upon it. There was a long pause, during which Dumbledore stared at the slip in his hands, and everyone in the room stared at Dumbledore. And then Professor Dumbledore cleared his throat and read out Harry Potter.